By around 460, leadership of the Romano-British resistance passed to Ambrosius Aurelianus, remembered by later writers as one of the last true representatives of Roman civilization in Britain. While he continued fighting the growing Germanic settlements, Roman authority elsewhere continued to fragment. Following the murder of Emperor Majorian, Aegidius established an independent Romano-Gallic state centered on Soissons, preserving Roman traditions in northern Gaul for a few more decades. By this stage, however, the age of Roman Britain had effectively come to an end, giving way to a new era dominated by Brittonic kingdoms, Anglo-Saxon settlements, and the emerging medieval world. By the early 460s, the Western Roman Empire was rapidly losing its remaining territories. In 462, the Roman commander Agrippinus handed over much of southern Gaul to the Visigoths, hoping to secure their support against the independent Roman ruler Aegidius. This agreement allowed the Visigoths to consolidate their kingdom around Toulouse, while the region gradually became known as Septimania. Despite this setback, Aegidius refused to surrender. Together with the Frankish king Childeric, he defeated the Visigoths at the Battle of Orléans in 463, proving that Roman resistance had not yet disappeared. Aegidius sought allies wherever he could, even opening diplomatic contacts with the Vandal king Genseric. His sudden death in 465, however, changed everything. His son Syagrius inherited the remaining Romano-Gallic territories and continued governing them as an independent Roman stronghold centered on Soissons. Although the Western Empire was collapsing, Syagrius remained determined to preserve Roman law, military traditions, and administration for as long as possible. In Britain, conflict between the native Britons and the Germanic settlers continued. Around 466, the Britons won an important but costly victory over Hengist and his son Oisc near Richborough. Neither side achieved a decisive advantage, and after heavy losses, the fighting temporarily subsided. During this brief period of peace, old hill forts across western Britain were rebuilt, new defensive earthworks such as Wansdyke were strengthened, and local rulers prepared for the next wave of invasions. Meanwhile, the Eastern Emperor Leo I attempted to restore stability in the west by placing Anthemius on the imperial throne. Relations between his government and Syagrius improved, but new dangers quickly emerged. Roman officials encouraged the Visigoths to attack the Britons living in Armorica, while thousands of Brittonic warriors crossed the English Channel to defend their relatives on the continent. Despite their courage, these forces suffered a crushing defeat, forcing many survivors to seek refuge among the Burgundians. Even so, the migration of Britons into Armorica continued, gradually transforming the region into what later became Brittany, or Little Britain. Across Britain, several new kingdoms emerged from the ruins of Roman administration. Elmet, Gododin, and other Brittonic states expanded their influence, while ancient strongholds such as Cadbury Hill were rebuilt into impressive fortified centers. Because of its enormous defenses and evidence of Mediterranean trade, Cadbury later became closely associated with the legendary court of Arthur in medieval tradition. Political turmoil continued across the empire. In 472, Emperor Anthemius was overthrown after another civil war that left Rome itself devastated once again. At the same time, the Visigoths completed their conquest of nearly all Roman Spain, leaving only scattered pockets of imperial influence. In Britain, Angles and Saxons continued arriving in increasing numbers, settling along the eastern coast and gradually extending their influence inland. A defining moment came in 476, traditionally remembered as the end of the Western Roman Empire. Odoacer deposed the young emperor Romulus Augustulus and assumed control of Italy while recognizing the Eastern Emperor Zeno as the senior ruler of the Roman world. Although later historians called the surviving eastern state the Byzantine Empire, its people still considered themselves Romans, and the empire itself continued to preserve Roman institutions for many centuries. Syagrius, however, refused to recognize Odoacer's authority and maintained his independent Romano-Gallic realm in northern Gaul. Germanic expansion accelerated during the following years. Around 477, the Saxon leader Aeli landed in southern Britain with his sons and founded the Kingdom of Sussex. His warriors defeated local Britons, captured important strongholds such as Pevensey, and gradually expanded their territory along the southern coast. Additional Brittonic kingdoms, including Rhegan and several western realms, also emerged as Roman political structures disappeared completely. The final years of the 5th century witnessed the rise of several figures who would shape medieval Europe. After the death of Julius Nepos, Emperor Zeno formally claimed authority over the entire Roman world, while Odoacer extended his rule across Italy and Dalmatia. In northern Gaul, Clovis inherited the Frankish throne and soon turned against Syagrius. At the same time, British tradition began celebrating a military commander known simply as Arthur. Rather than describing him as a king, the earliest accounts present him as a great war leader who united the Britons against the growing Saxon threat. In 486, Clovis defeated Syagrius at the Battle of Soissons, destroying the last independent Roman state in Western Europe. From that point onward, Frankish power dominated northern Gaul, while Roman political authority finally disappeared from the region. Britain entered the sub-Roman age, where local kingdoms rather than imperial governors controlled the island. The years that followed saw further Saxon expansion. Hengist died and was succeeded by his son Oesk, while Aella continued extending his kingdom across Sussex. The missionary Patrick transformed Christianity in Ireland, and the Ostrogothic king Theodoric established a remarkably stable government in Italy that preserved many Roman traditions while allowing religious tolerance. Another important migration occurred in 495 when Cerdic and his followers landed on Britain's southern coast, laying the foundations of the future Kingdom of Wessex. Soon afterward came one of the defining battles of early British history. Around 496, the Britons, led by Arthur, according to later tradition, achieved a decisive victory at the Battle of Mons Badonicus. The triumph halted Saxon expansion for an entire generation, creating a rare period of peace during which the surviving Brittonic kingdoms were able to recover. Although Roman Britain had long since disappeared, its military traditions, culture, and identity endured through these kingdoms, bridging the ancient Roman world and the emerging Middle Ages. By the close of the 5th century, Britain and Western Europe had entered an age of profound transformation. Around 497, King Urban of Dumnonia died, while on the continent Clovis I strengthened ties with the Britons who had settled in Armorica. Through agreements negotiated by influential church leaders, the Franks allowed continued migration from Britain in exchange for political loyalty rather than tribute. As more Britons crossed the Channel, the region gradually evolved into Brittany, where several small kingdoms emerged, each preserving strong Brittonic traditions while developing their own identities. At roughly the same time, Ireland experienced major political changes. The Fir Domnan were gradually displaced westward by the expanding Lygin, giving the province of Leinster its modern name. In the south, the Eoganachta dynasty replaced older ruling families and established dominance over Munster. Across the sea in Brittany, kingdoms such as Domnonia, Cornouailles, and Van were founded by rulers remembered in later tradition as immigrants from Wales and Western Britain, further strengthening the cultural links between the two shores. Around the year 500, Romano-British leaders fought to recover territories that had fallen under Irish control. Supported by commanders connected to the remnants of the old Roman navy, and by allies from Brittany, local rulers reclaimed parts of southwest Wales after defeating Irish forces in a decisive campaign. Yet while victories were still possible, Rome itself had become only a shadow of its former greatness. The once mighty imperial capital, which had housed well over 1 million inhabitants during its peak, had declined to a city of fewer than 50,000 people. The first years of the 6th century witnessed the birth of several new kingdoms. Rhegan fell to the South Saxons, while rulers in northern Britain established states such as Afterid and strengthened older realms like Rheged and Altclut. In Ireland, new high kings continued to emerge, and the Kingdom of Dalriata expanded its influence across western Scotland, creating lasting connections between Ireland and Britain. On the continent, Clovis transformed the political balance of Western Europe. After years of rivalry with the Visigoths, he united the Franks with the Armorican Britons, Burgundians, and Alans in a massive campaign. His decisive victory at the Battle of Vouillé in 507 shattered Visigothic dominance in Gaul, leaving them with only Septimania and Spain, while Aquitaine passed into Frankish hands. The triumph established Clovis as the most powerful ruler in Western Europe, and the Eastern Roman Emperor honored him with prestigious Roman titles, recognizing both his military achievements and political importance. Meanwhile, Britain remained divided between native kingdoms and expanding Germanic settlers. The Saxon leader Cerdic pushed farther inland, while religious and educational life continued to flourish despite the political turmoil. Important monasteries and schools were founded, including the famous community at Llantwit Major, which would become one of the greatest centers of learning in early medieval Britain. Traditional Welsh sources also remember the Battle of Longborth, where King Geraint of Dumnonia fought alongside Arthur against invading enemies. Although Geraint was killed, these stories helped preserve Arthur's reputation as a courageous military commander rather than a crowned monarch. During the same period, Theodoric the Great restored much of Roman administration in southern Gaul while preserving imperial traditions from his base in Italy. After Clovis died in 511, the Frankish kingdom was divided among his sons, yet Frankish influence continued to expand. Theodoric restored the prefecture of Gaul, while church councils strengthened cooperation between the Frankish monarchy and the Christian clergy. In southern Britain, however, Saxon kingdoms continued growing. Following the death of Aiel, his successors maintained Sussex, although its influence gradually declined as neighboring Germanic kingdoms became stronger. According to later tradition, the famous Battle of Camlann took place during this era, where both Arthur and Medrawd were said to have fallen. Whether entirely historical or partly legendary, the story symbolized the end of one generation of Brittonic leadership. Around the same time, Cerdic established the royal dynasty that would eventually rule Wessex for centuries, while several northern British rulers divided their territories among their heirs, creating new regional kingdoms that shaped the political landscape of post-Roman Britain. Religion and scholarship flourished despite constant warfare. St. Brendan became famous for his legendary Atlantic voyage in search of the Isle of the Blessed, while monasteries founded by saints such as Cadoc and Samson grew into major centers of learning. Stone inscriptions from Wales also demonstrate that Roman culture had not completely disappeared, as Latin continued to be used on memorials well into the 6th century, preserving echoes of the Roman world long after imperial rule had ended. By the late 520s, the balance of power continued shifting. New Saxon kingdoms emerged in southeastern England, while the Gewissae expanded through a series of victories over neighboring Britons. At the same time, Emperor Justinian began his reign in Constantinople, ushering in one of the greatest periods of the Eastern Roman Empire. His government closed the ancient Academy of Plato in Athens, symbolizing the final end of one of the classical world's oldest philosophical institutions. Around 530, Germanic expansion in Britain accelerated once again. The Britons lost further territory, including the Isle of Wight and parts of central England, as Saxon and Angle settlements steadily expanded. Even so, many Brittonic kingdoms remained independent, preserving Roman traditions, Celtic culture, and Christian learning. Britain had entered a new age where the legacy of Rome, the ambitions of Germanic kingdoms, and the resilience of the native Britons would together shape the foundations of medieval Britain. The middle decades of the 6th century marked a period of dramatic change across Britain, Ireland, and the former Western Roman world. In 534, Cynric became ruler of the Gewissae, strengthening one of the growing Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in southern Britain. At the same time, the brilliant Eastern Roman general Belisarius completed the destruction of the Vandal kingdom in North Africa, restoring the region to imperial rule and beginning Emperor Justinian's ambitious campaign to rebuild the Roman Empire. His victories soon expanded into Italy, where years of brutal warfare against the Ostrogoths sought to reclaim the old heart of the empire. While the Eastern Empire experienced a remarkable revival, Britain remained politically divided. Kingdoms frequently split apart as rulers died or were overthrown. Reged lost part of its territory, Powys was shaken by internal conflict, and several rulers were driven into exile. Religious life, however, continued to flourish. Great churchmen such as Saint Iltude and Saint Gildas established monasteries and schools that preserved learning during an age of constant warfare. Around this time, Gildas settled in Brittany, where he became one of the most respected religious figures of the age. The year 536 brought one of the greatest natural disasters of the ancient world. Massive volcanic eruptions darkened the skies across much of the northern hemisphere, causing temperatures to fall dramatically. Crop failures, famine, and economic hardship spread across Europe for several years, affecting nearly every kingdom. Political instability worsened as rulers struggled to cope with food shortages and unrest. During the late 530s and early 540s, civil wars erupted in several Brittonic kingdoms. Rival princes fought for power, while ambitious rulers expanded their influence through warfare and political intrigue. Around this period, Gildas composed his famous work De Excidio Britanniae, a passionate criticism of Britain's rulers. Rather than celebrating their victories, he condemned them for corruption, violence, and moral failure, warning that their divisions threatened the survival of their people. A far greater catastrophe followed in 541, when the plague of Justinian swept across Europe. The disease devastated cities and villages alike, killing countless people throughout the Roman Empire, Britain, and Ireland. Entire communities were weakened, trade declined sharply, and many kingdoms struggled to recover from repeated outbreaks that continued for generations. Despite these hardships, Christianity continued expanding. New monasteries appeared across Ireland and Wales, including famous foundations at Douro, Clonmacnoise, Bangor, and Killedy. Church councils condemned remaining Pelagian beliefs, while St. David emerged as one of the leading religious figures in Wales. These monasteries soon became centers of education, preserving Latin learning, copying manuscripts, and training generations of scholars and missionaries. Meanwhile, political struggles continued across both Britain and Brittany. Succession disputes divided Breton kingdoms, while rival families competed for control with the support of influential bishops. In northern Britain, Germanic expansion accelerated. Around 547, the Angle leader Ida captured the stronghold of Bamberg and established the Kingdom of Bernicia, creating one of the foundations of the future Kingdom of Northumbria. The native Britons resisted fiercely, but the balance of power was steadily shifting. The plague struck Britain particularly hard in the late 540s, claiming the lives of many prominent rulers, including the powerful king Maelgwn of Gwynedd. Curiously, early traditions often claim that the Saxon settlers suffered far less from the epidemic, allowing them to continue expanding while many Brittonic kingdoms struggled to recover. Around the middle of the century, several more Brittonic kingdoms emerged as older territories divided among local rulers. At the same time, groups of Britons from Wales and Dumnonia crossed the sea to northwestern Spain, founding the colony known as Brittonia. There, they preserved their language, traditions, and distinctive Celtic Christian practices while remaining connected to their homeland across the sea. The Eastern Roman Empire also continued its remarkable recovery. Imperial armies reconquered parts of southern Spain, while General Narses finally defeated the Ostrogoths and restored Roman authority over Italy in 554. Although Justinian had recovered large areas of the former Western Empire, these victories came at enormous financial and human cost. In Britain, however, the advance of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms continued. Cynric and later his son Ceawlin defeated several Brittonic armies and steadily expanded the territory of the Guisae. Important Roman cities and fortresses gradually fell into Germanic hands, while new Anglo-Saxon settlements spread across southern and eastern England. Even London, once one of Roman Britain's greatest cities, had largely declined before new Saxon communities developed nearby. Throughout the 550s and 560s, Britain remained a land of competing kingdoms. Bernicia, Deira, Reged, Altclut, Powys, Gwynedd, and Dumnonia all fought for survival, while Angles, Saxons, and Jutes continued pressing westward. At the same time, Ireland experienced a remarkable religious flowering. St. Columba founded the famous monastery of Iona in 563, which became one of the greatest centers of Christian learning in northern Europe. From there, missionaries carried Christianity throughout Scotland and beyond. The final years of this period saw continuing wars between Britons, Picts, Irish kingdoms, and the expanding Anglo-Saxon states. Urien of Reged emerged as one of the strongest Brittonic rulers, leading campaigns against the Angles and defending northern Britain. Meanwhile, church councils in both Britain and Spain recognized the growing Brittonic communities established overseas, confirming that even as Roman Britain disappeared politically, its culture, faith, and traditions continued to spread across Western Europe. By the close of the 6th century, the Roman age had fully given way to the medieval world, where powerful new kingdoms, Christian monasteries, and regional dynasties would define the future of Britain and its neighboring lands. During the final decades of the 6th century, Britain remained a land of constant warfare as the expanding Anglo-Saxon kingdoms steadily pushed into territories still held by the Britons. In 571, the Gewissae under Cuthwulf captured several important settlements across the Midlands after defeating local Brittonic rulers. Around the same time, the East Anglian kingdom strengthened under King Wulfa, whose dynasty would become one of the most influential in eastern England. For the next 20 years, northern Britain became the center of a long struggle between the Anglian kingdom of Bernicia and the Brittonic rulers collectively remembered as the Men of the North. Powerful kings such as Urien of Reged, Rhydderch Hael of Alt-Clut, Gwalog of Elmet, and others repeatedly united against the expanding Angles. Although alliances shifted frequently, they shared the common goal of preserving the last independent Brittonic kingdoms. During these same years, Christianity continued spreading throughout the Celtic world. At the Council of Braga, the monastery of Britonia in northwestern Spain received its first bishop, demonstrating how Brittonic communities established across the sea had become firmly rooted. New monasteries also appeared throughout Scotland and northern Britain, including the foundation that eventually developed into the city of Glasgow. The Battle of Afterid became one of the most famous conflicts of the age. Rival Brittonic kings fought for control of the north, ending with the death of Gwendolew. According to later Welsh tradition, the legendary bard Myrddin, better known in later legend as Merlin, lost his mind after witnessing the slaughter and wandered into the forests as a prophet. Whether entirely historical or partly legendary, the story became one of the foundations of Arthurian tradition. In 574, Iardan mac Gabrian became king of Dalriata and transformed the kingdom into a major regional power. Supported by St. Columba, he united several smaller territories and launched campaigns across western Scotland, the Isle of Man, the Orkneys, and surrounding seas. His reign marked the beginning of Dalriata's greatest period of influence. The following years brought both diplomacy and war. The Council of Druim Chet strengthened cooperation between Irish rulers while recognizing the growing independence of Dalriata in Scotland. Elsewhere, Corlin of the Gewissae achieved one of the greatest Anglo-Saxon victories at the Battle of Direham in 577. 3 Brittonic kings were killed, and the capture of Bath, Cirencester, and Gloucester permanently separated Dumnonia in the southwest from the Brittonic kingdoms of Wales, changing Britain's political geography forever. While Anglo-Saxon expansion continued, Brittany also experienced repeated conflicts. Local rulers fought both among themselves and against Frankish kings attempting to extend their authority. Despite these pressures, Breton independence survived, and its rulers continued preserving strong Brittonic traditions inherited from earlier migrants. In northern Britain, Urien of Reged emerged as perhaps the greatest military leader of his generation. Together with his son Owain, he won several victories over Bernicia, defeating Anglian armies in a series of fierce campaigns. Yet these successes proved temporary. Rivalries between Brittonic rulers often undermined their own resistance, allowing the Angles to recover after each defeat. The 580s witnessed dramatic political changes throughout Britain and Europe. The Eastern Roman Emperor Maurice reorganized what remained of the empire's western territories by creating the Exarchates of Italy and Africa, giving military governors both civil and military authority. Meanwhile, the Visigoths completed the conquest of the Suevic kingdom in northwestern Spain, bringing almost the entire Iberian Peninsula under their rule. In Britain, warfare continued almost without pause. Seulin's advance was checked by the Britons at the Battle of Fethenley, where the former King Tuedrig fought one final campaign before dying from his wounds. Although the Britons achieved important victories, Anglo-Saxon kingdoms continued expanding across central and southern England. Religious change also reshaped Europe. In 589, King Record of the Visigoths abandoned Arian Christianity and converted to the Catholic faith at the Third Council of Toledo. His decision united the Visigothic kingdom with the wider Christian world and strengthened relations with the Roman Church. Around the same time, Urien of Reged attempted one final grand alliance against Bernicia. Brittonic armies surrounded the Anglian stronghold on Lindisfarne and seemed close to achieving a decisive victory. However, before the campaign could succeed, Urien was assassinated by a rival acting on behalf of another Brittonic ruler. His death shattered the alliance, the siege collapsed, and the Angles survived what may have been their greatest crisis. The years that followed brought even more setbacks for the Britons. Ceawlin was eventually defeated and replaced by a new dynasty among the Gewissae, while Bernicia continued expanding after the deaths of several Brittonic kings. Reged itself declined following the death of Urien's son Owain, and many smaller kingdoms gradually disappeared beneath the growing power of the Anglo-Saxon states. Despite the relentless warfare, the 6th century also became a golden age of Celtic Christianity. Saint Columba founded the monastery of Iona, which grew into one of Europe's greatest centers of learning and missionary activity. In 597, another major turning point arrived when Augustine landed in Kent to begin the Gregorian mission. His successful conversion of the Anglo-Saxons laid the foundation for the English Church and permanently transformed the religious future of Britain. By the end of the century, the political map had changed dramatically. Bernicia, East Anglia, Essex, and the Gewissae continued expanding, while the remaining Brittonic kingdoms fought to preserve their independence. Around the year 600, the famous Battle of Cattraeth, celebrated in the Welsh poem Wai Gododin, symbolized both the extraordinary courage of the Brittonic warriors and the harsh reality that the balance of power had shifted. Roman Britain had become a distant memory, replaced by a new medieval world shaped by Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Celtic rulers, Christian monasteries, and the enduring legends of heroes such as Urien, Columba, and Arthur. The opening decades of the 7th century marked another decisive turning point in the history of Britain. While the old Romano-British kingdoms struggled to preserve their independence, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms grew stronger each year, and Christianity continued spreading across both Britain and Ireland. Political alliances shifted constantly as rulers fought not only foreign enemies, but also one another for survival. In 601, an important church gathering was held at Chester, while the rulers of Dumnonia granted land at Glastonbury for the construction of what would become one of Britain's most famous monasteries. Across the Channel, Aquitaine emerged as a largely independent duchy under Gallo-Roman and Basque influence, preserving many Roman traditions despite the collapse of imperial authority. At the same time, the Eastern Roman Empire entered its final and greatest war with the Sasanian Persians, a conflict that would reshape the entire Near East. Saint Augustine of Canterbury attempted to persuade the Brittonic bishops to recognize Roman customs and cooperate in converting the Anglo-Saxons. The British clergy, however, refused to abandon their own traditions or accept Canterbury's authority, leaving a deep division between the Celtic and Roman churches. While religious disagreements continued, new Anglo-Saxon kingdoms expanded across eastern Britain, and Bernicia steadily increased its power. A major turning point came in 603 at the Battle of Degsastan. King Iadon of Dalriata led a coalition against Ethelfrith of Bernicia, but suffered a devastating defeat. Several of Iadon's sons were killed, ending Dalriata's ambitions of dominating northern Britain. From that moment onward, Bernicia emerged as the strongest military power in the north. Around the same period, the Lombards abandoned Arian Christianity and embraced Catholicism, further strengthening the influence of the Roman Church throughout Western Europe. Relations between the Britons and Augustine deteriorated even further when a second meeting ended in complete failure. Neither side was willing to compromise, ensuring that the British Church would continue developing independently for many years. Meanwhile, Ethelfrith conquered Deira and united it with Bernicia, creating the powerful kingdom of Northumbria. The exiled Prince Edwin escaped to Wales before later seeking protection elsewhere, keeping alive his claim to the northern throne. During the following years, new kingdoms continued to emerge. Mercia developed into an important Anglo-Saxon power under King Searle, while the Gewissae steadily expanded farther into southern Britain. Across the Eastern Roman Empire, Emperor Heraclius introduced Greek as the official language of government, reflecting the empire's gradual transformation from its Latin-speaking Roman past into the medieval Byzantine world. The year 613 witnessed one of the most famous battles of early medieval Britain. A united alliance of Gwynedd, Powys, Pengwern, and Dumnonia confronted Ethelfrith at Chester in an attempt to halt Northumbrian expansion. Although the outcome remains debated, the campaign proved disastrous for the Britons. Many important rulers were killed, and shortly afterward, hundreds of monks from the nearby monastery of Bangor were massacred. The defeat permanently weakened communication between the northern Brittonic kingdoms and those of Wales, making future cooperation far more difficult. Only a few years later, fortune turned against Ethelfrith himself. In 616, he was defeated and killed at the Battle of the River Idle by Edwin, who had secured the support of King Redwald of East Anglia. Edwin reclaimed Deira and took control of Northumbria, while Ethelfrith's family fled into exile among the northern Britons and the Scots of Dalriata. At the same time, religious conflict continued in Kent and Essex, where pagan reactions temporarily forced several Christian bishops to flee before the church eventually recovered. Edwin quickly became one of the most powerful rulers in Britain. He conquered Elmet, expanded Northumbrian influence deep into former Brittonic territory, and was eventually baptized into Christianity by Bishop Paulinus. His conversion encouraged many nobles to follow the Christian faith and helped establish York as one of the leading religious centers of northern England. Elsewhere, the political landscape continued changing. The Visigoths completed their conquest of the remaining Byzantine possessions in Spain, while new kingdoms appeared across Ireland. In Britain, Mercia rose under the ambitious warrior Penda, whose growing power challenged both Northumbria and the southern Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Rivalries between Edwin, Penda, and Cadwallon of Gwynedd soon became the defining struggle of the age. By the late 620s, the Eastern Roman Empire achieved one of its greatest victories when Emperor Heraclius crushed the Sasanian Persians after generations of warfare. The ancient Roman-Persian conflict, which had lasted for centuries, finally came to an end. Following his triumph, Heraclius adopted new imperial titles and increasingly emphasized the empire's Greek identity, marking the beginning of the medieval Byzantine era. Back in Britain, events moved toward another dramatic confrontation. Cadwallon of Gwynedd returned from exile and formed an unlikely alliance with the pagan king Penda of Mercia. Together, they launched a devastating campaign against Northumbria, defeating Edwin's armies and ravaging much of the kingdom. At the same time, Christianity continued spreading among the Anglo-Saxons as new bishoprics, monasteries, and convents were founded across eastern England. By the early 630s, Britain had become a land where expanding Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, resilient Brittonic rulers, ambitious Irish dynasties, and the rapidly growing Christian church all competed to shape the future of the island. The middle of the 7th century was a period of dramatic political, religious, and military change across Britain. In 633, the British king Cadwallon of Gwynedd formed a powerful alliance with the Mercian ruler Penda and confronted the Northumbrian king Edwin at the Battle of Hatfield Chase. Edwin was killed, ending one of the strongest reigns in early Anglo-Saxon England. His family fled south into Kent, while Bishop Paulinus escaped with them, preserving the Christian mission that Edwin had supported. At roughly the same time, church leaders in Visigothic Spain officially replaced the ancient Celtic liturgy of Britannia with the Visigothic Rite, reflecting the growing influence of a more unified Christian tradition. Cadwallon continued his campaign by defeating Edwin's successors one after another, temporarily making Gwynedd the dominant military power in Britain. His remarkable victories came to an abrupt end in 634 when Oswald returned from exile in Dalriata with support from monks of Iona and defeated Cadwallon at the Battle of Heavenfield. Cadwallon was killed and Oswald reunited Northumbria, beginning one of the kingdom's greatest periods of expansion. Around the same time, the missionary Birinus arrived among the West Saxons and established the bishopric that would later become one of southern England's leading religious centers. Christianity continued spreading rapidly. Saint Aidan left Iona to found the monastery of Lindisfarne in 635, creating a center of learning and missionary activity that profoundly influenced northern Britain. Across the Channel, Breton rulers strengthened their kingdom through diplomacy with the Franks, while several kings voluntarily abandoned their thrones to enter monasteries, illustrating the growing prestige of religious life during this period. A major turning point came in 637 at the Battle of Mag Rath. Domnall Brecc of Dalriata suffered a crushing defeat against the High King of Ireland, permanently weakening his kingdom. From that moment onward, Western Dalriata gradually fell under Irish influence, while its eastern territories increasingly depended on Northumbria and later the Picts. Shortly afterward, Northumbria peacefully absorbed Reged through dynastic marriage and completed its conquest of the remaining territory of Gododin, extending its authority across much of northern Britain. Beyond Britain, the world was changing with astonishing speed. Muslim armies swept out of Arabia and rapidly conquered Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and much of North Africa, ending centuries of Roman rule in those regions. Despite these enormous losses, the Eastern Roman Empire entered a new phase of stability after Emperor Heraclius defeated the Sasanian Persians, laying the foundations for what historians often describe as Byzantium's medieval Golden Age. The rise of Mercia reshaped the balance of power in Britain. Under the ambitious king Penda, Mercia defeated and killed Oswald at the Battle of Maserfield in 642, becoming the strongest kingdom in central England. Meanwhile, Oswald's brother Oswiu secured Northumbria by marrying into Edwin's royal family and preparing for an inevitable conflict with Mercia. During the same period, Visigothic Spain introduced a unified legal code that largely erased the distinction between Romans and Visigoths, creating a common identity that would eventually evolve into the medieval Spanish people. Throughout the 640s, Britain endured famine, political unrest, and repeated warfare. Gwynedd descended into civil conflict, while the West Saxon king Cenwalh was driven into exile before later returning to reclaim his throne. Mercia expanded relentlessly, conquering neighboring territories and placing loyal rulers over newly acquired lands. At the same time, Scandinavian seafarers began settling the Orkney and Shetland Islands, foreshadowing the Viking expansion that would transform northern Europe centuries later. Religious conversion continued even among the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Northumbrian missionaries established churches throughout Essex, while Christian influence spread across East Anglia and Mercia through royal marriages and monastic foundations. Yet political rivalries remained fierce. Oswiu struggled constantly against Penda, while smaller kingdoms repeatedly shifted their loyalties depending on the fortunes of war. The decisive confrontation finally arrived in 655 at the Battle of the Winwade. Penda assembled a vast coalition against Northumbria, but several allies abandoned him before the fighting began. Oswiu seized the opportunity, winning a decisive victory in which both Penda and the East Anglian king Ethelhere were killed. The battle transformed Britain overnight. Oswiu reunited Northumbria, briefly dominated Mercia, and emerged as the most powerful ruler in Britain. Christianity also gained an enormous advantage, as the remaining pagan rulers either converted or lost their influence. Following his triumph, Oswiu reorganized much of central England. Mercia was placed under subordinate rulers, new bishoprics and monasteries were founded, and Christianity spread rapidly throughout the Midlands. Great religious centers such as Medeshamstede, later known as Peterborough, and Whitby were established during these years, becoming major centers of education, manuscript production, and missionary work. Although warfare continued, the political landscape had changed dramatically by the late 600s and 50s. Northumbria stood at the height of its influence. Mercia slowly recovered under new leadership, and the surviving Brittonic kingdoms found themselves increasingly surrounded by expanding Anglo-Saxon states. At the same time, the Eastern Roman Empire was adapting to the loss of its eastern provinces, while the rapidly expanding Islamic Caliphate emerged as a dominant new power across the Mediterranean. Britain had entered a new chapter in which kingdoms would increasingly be defined not only by military strength, but also by Christianity, royal alliances, and the growing network of monasteries that shaped medieval society. The decades between the late 650s and early 680s brought profound political, military, and religious change to Britain. In 658, the West Saxon king Cenwalh defeated a combined force from Dumnonia and Gwynedd, expanding his kingdom farther into the southwest. The conquered lands were gradually settled by Saxons, while Glastonbury Abbey, despite falling under West Saxon rule, continued to flourish under its existing religious leadership. At the same time, Mercian nobles rebelled against Northumbrian control, placing Wulfhere on the throne and restoring Mercia as an independent kingdom. Religious organization also evolved rapidly. Cenwalh divided his bishopric after disagreements with Bishop Agilbert, creating a new ecclesiastical center at Winchester. Across England, Christianity continued spreading despite occasional resistance. Several East Saxon rulers accepted baptism, while new monasteries and churches appeared throughout the country, reflecting the growing influence of the Roman Church. Meanwhile, Northumbria expanded its authority into Pictish territory under King Oswiu, extending influence across much of northern Britain. In the wider Mediterranean world, Emperor Constans II temporarily moved the imperial court from Constantinople to Sicily and even visited Rome, something no emperor had done for centuries. A devastating epidemic, remembered as the Yellow Plague, swept across Britain and Ireland beginning in 664. The disease claimed thousands of lives, including kings, bishops, and abbots, leaving many kingdoms politically unstable. Despite the tragedy, one of the most significant church gatherings in British history took place that same year. At the Synod of Whitby, Northumbria officially adopted Roman rather than Celtic religious customs, bringing the Northern English Church into closer alignment with Rome. The decision reshaped English Christianity and strengthened the influence of Roman traditions for generations. The following years saw continuing religious reforms. Theodore of Tarsus arrived as Archbishop of Canterbury and reorganized the English Church into a far more structured system of dioceses and bishoprics. Under his leadership, Christianity became more centralized, new churches were founded, and bishops were appointed throughout the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Monasteries such as Chertsey, Barking, Ely, Monkwearmouth, Jarrow, and later Selsey became important centers of learning, manuscript production, and missionary work. Beyond Britain, the Mediterranean world was changing just as dramatically. Muslim armies completed the conquest of most of North Africa, leaving the Byzantine Empire with only a few remaining coastal possessions. Meanwhile, Constantinople remained the center of a revitalized Eastern Roman Empire, while new powers such as Bulgaria emerged in the Balkans, permanently altering the political balance of southeastern Europe. Political rivalry within Britain remained constant. Wulfhere transformed Mercia into the strongest kingdom in central England, repeatedly challenging Northumbrian dominance. Northumbria, under Oswiu and later Ecgfrith, answered with campaigns against both Mercia and the Picts. Victories and defeats shifted the balance of power almost yearly. Battles near the River Trent and across northern England demonstrated that neither kingdom could establish permanent supremacy. In Wales and the Western Brittonic kingdoms, resistance against Anglo-Saxon expansion continued despite growing pressure. Dumnonia gradually lost more territory to the West Saxons, while new regional kingdoms emerged from older Brittonic lands. At the same time, rulers in Ceredigion expanded their authority, creating political foundations that would shape medieval Wales for centuries. The Church remained deeply involved in politics. Archbishop Theodore convened several councils that established common rules for the English Church and resolved disputes among bishops. Yet, conflict persisted. The influential Bishop Wilfrid repeatedly clashed with Northumbrian kings over church authority and diocesan boundaries. Although temporarily exiled, he continued founding monasteries and spreading Christianity wherever he traveled. The late 670s and early 680s witnessed further administrative reforms. New dioceses were created across Mercia, Northumbria, and Sussex, allowing Christianity to reach even remote communities. Missionaries attempted to convert neighboring peoples, including the Frisians, while scholars produced remarkable manuscripts such as the Book of Durrow, one of the masterpieces of early medieval Celtic art. Military conflict never ceased. Ecgfrith campaigned against the Picts, while Bride of Fortriu expanded his own authority in northern Scotland and eventually destroyed the independence of Orkney. In southern Britain, the West Saxons continued driving the Britons farther west. According to later tradition, by 682 they had forced many of the remaining people of Dumnonia back toward the sea, marking another major stage in the gradual Anglo-Saxon expansion across Britain. By the beginning of the 680s, Britain had become a patchwork of powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, resilient Brittonic states, flourishing monasteries, and ambitious church leaders. While wars continued almost without interruption, Christianity, learning, and royal administration steadily reshaped society, laying many of the foundations upon which medieval England, Wales, and Scotland would eventually develop. The final years of the 7th century brought major political and religious changes that reshaped Britain and much of Western Europe. In 683, the northern kingdom of Bernicia expanded farther into Brittonic territory, while the Pictish king Bride strengthened his authority by forcing Dalriata to recognize his supremacy after capturing its important royal fortress of Dunad. In the south, leadership also changed as Saebi became king of Essex following the death of his brother Sighere. Northumbria reached the height of its power under King Ecgfrith, but his ambitions soon led to disaster. In 684, he ignored the advice of church leaders and launched a raid into Ireland, attacking the kingdom of Brega. The campaign brought little lasting gain and damaged his reputation. Only a year later, he marched north against the Picts. At the Battle of Dun Nectain in 685, the Picts, supported by warriors from Dalriata and the Britons of Alt-Clut, destroyed the Northumbrian army. Ecgfrith was killed, Northumbria lost much of its influence beyond the River Forth, and Pictish independence was firmly restored. His half-brother Aldfrith, who had been living in exile at Iona, was recalled to become the new king. At the same time, southern Britain experienced equally dramatic events. The energetic king Cadwalla of Wessex launched campaigns across Sussex, Kent, Essex, and the Isle of Wight. He defeated local rulers, expanded West Saxon authority, and worked closely with the missionary Wilfrid to spread Christianity in the newly conquered territories. His victories transformed Wessex into one of the strongest kingdoms in southern England. During these years, a terrible outbreak of plague struck several monasteries, killing many monks and leaving only a handful of survivors at famous houses such as Monk Wearmouth and Jarrow, where the young Bede continued his education. In 687, rebellion broke out in Kent, where King Mul, Cadwalla's brother, was killed by local insurgents. Cadwalla responded with a devastating invasion that restored his authority. Around the same time, the respected scholar and abbot Adamnan secured the release of Irish prisoners who had been captured during earlier Northumbrian raids. St. Cuthbert also withdrew from public life and died shortly afterward, becoming one of the most venerated saints in northern Britain. A surprising change came in 688 when Cadwalla voluntarily gave up his throne and traveled to Rome as a pilgrim. After receiving baptism from Pope Sergius I, he died only days later. His successor, Ine, became one of the greatest rulers of Wessex, reorganizing the kingdom and strengthening royal authority. During his reign, the people of the Gewissae increasingly became known simply as the West Saxons, or Wessex. At the same time, Mercia expanded its influence across much of southern Britain, while the church in Alt-Clut accepted Roman religious customs following the efforts of Adamnan. The closing years of the century witnessed important religious reforms. Theodore of Tarsus completed the reorganization of the English Church before his death, leaving behind a far more unified system of dioceses and bishops. His successor, Bertwald, continued this work, while missionaries such as Willibrord crossed the North Sea to preach among the Frisians. His efforts eventually led to the establishment of a major religious center at Utrecht, which became one of the leading missionary bases in northern Europe. King Ine also introduced one of the earliest Anglo-Saxon law codes outside Kent. His legislation clearly distinguished between the English and the native Britons, showing that large Brittonic communities still lived under West Saxon rule while maintaining many of their own traditions. In Kent, King Witred issued his own legal code, further strengthening royal government and the influence of the church. Beyond Britain, the Mediterranean world was changing rapidly. Muslim armies completed the conquest of Carthage in 698, bringing centuries of Byzantine rule in North Africa to an end. The city was heavily damaged, and political power shifted to the newly founded center at Tunis. Meanwhile, the Byzantine Empire continued adapting to its losses while recognizing the growing power of the First Bulgarian Empire in the Balkans. The Council of Bur in Ireland became another landmark event. Led by Adomnan of Iona, church and political leaders introduced the famous Cain Adomnain, also known as the Law of the Innocents. The new legislation protected women, children, and clergy from violence during warfare and became one of the earliest humanitarian legal reforms in medieval Europe. During the same period, more Irish churches accepted Roman customs, bringing religious practices across Ireland and Western Scotland into closer agreement with continental Christianity. The beginning of the 8th century saw further political adjustments. Cornubia, or Cornwall, was increasingly recognized as a distinct region within the Old Kingdom of Dumnonia. Church leaders urged the remaining Brittonic kingdoms to adopt Roman customs completely, while Inni replaced many local sub-kings with loyal officials, creating a stronger and more centralized administration. New dioceses, monasteries, and schools continued to appear throughout southern Britain, helping Christianity become the dominant cultural force of the age. The years after 705 were marked by frequent successions, royal pilgrimages, and renewed wars. Several kings abandoned their thrones to become monks, reflecting the enormous prestige of religious life. At the same time, conflicts between Wessex, Northumbria, the Picts, Dalriata, and the Brittonic kingdoms continued almost without interruption. Geraint of Dumnonia died fighting against the expanding West Saxons, while Northumbrian armies campaigned repeatedly against the Picts. In 711, events far beyond Britain changed European history forever. Muslim forces crossed from North Africa into the Iberian Peninsula and defeated the Visigothic king Roderick at the Battle of Guadalete. Within only a few years, most of Spain had fallen under Umayyad rule, giving birth to Al-Andalus. As Britain continued its own struggles between Anglo-Saxons, Britons, Picts, and Irish kingdoms, Western Europe entered an entirely new era in which old Roman traditions, emerging Christian kingdoms, and powerful new civilizations would shape the medieval world for centuries to come. The early 8th century was a period of shifting power across Britain and Western Europe. In East Anglia, King Elfwald succeeded his father and ruled during a relatively stable era, while in Wessex, Queen Cuthber founded the great monastery of Wimborne, which soon became an important center of learning and religious life. Beyond Britain, Muslim armies continued advancing across the Iberian Peninsula, extending their control into the northwest after years of successful conquest. At the same time, Northumbria produced one of its greatest artistic treasures. Around 715, the magnificent Lindisfarne Gospels were created, demonstrating the extraordinary skill of the island's monks. Yet political rivalry continued. King Aini of Wessex fought Mercia in an inconclusive struggle for influence, while in northern Scotland, King Nectan encouraged his kingdom to adopt Roman Christian practices, further reducing the influence of the older Celtic traditions. A new chapter began in 716 when Ethelbald seized the Mercian throne. His reign marked the beginning of Mercia's return as the dominant kingdom of southern Britain. Northumbria, by contrast, entered another period of instability as kings rose and fell in quick succession through rebellion and assassination. During these same years, the missionary Boniface left England to preach among the Germanic peoples, beginning a career that would eventually make him one of the most influential figures in European Christianity. Religious reforms accelerated throughout Britain. In 717, the Pictish king Nectan expelled clergy who refused to follow Roman customs, while even the monastery of Iona gradually accepted continental practices after generations of resistance. These decisions helped bring the churches of Britain, Ireland, and Scotland into closer alignment with Rome. Beyond Britain, Europe witnessed another historic turning point. In 718, the Visigothic noble Pelagius defeated Muslim forces at the Battle of Covadonga, establishing the Kingdom of Asturias. Though small, this victory became the symbolic beginning of the long Reconquista, the Christian effort to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula. During the following years, Muslim armies expanded into southern Gaul, capturing Septimania, while King Ini strengthened Wessex by constructing churches and reinforcing royal authority. In 721, Duke Odo of Aquitaine achieved a remarkable victory at the Battle of Toulouse, temporarily halting the advance of Al-Andalus into Western Europe. Britain remained divided by constant warfare. In 722, the Britons of Cornwall and Dumnonia defeated the West Saxons in several important battles, forcing King Ine to retreat after suffering heavy losses. Despite these setbacks, Anglo-Saxon kingdoms continued expanding elsewhere. Mercia steadily increased its influence, while Kent experienced repeated dynastic struggles after the death of King Witred. By the mid-720s, King Uine chose to abdicate and travel to Rome as a pilgrim, ending one of the longest and most successful reigns in Wessex. His successor inherited a kingdom that had become one of the strongest powers in southern England. Around the same time, Bede completed the Reckoning of Time, another major contribution to medieval scholarship. The late 720s and early 730s saw the rise of the powerful Pictish king Oengus Macfergus. After defeating his rivals, he united much of Pictland and eventually extended his influence over Dal Riata. In Wales, Powys successfully expelled Mercian control for a time, while in Northumbria, the scholar Bede completed his masterpiece, The Ecclesiastical History of the English People, preserving invaluable knowledge about the early history of Britain. Events beyond the British Isles continued changing Europe. In 732, Charles Martel defeated the Umayyad army at the Battle of Tours, stopping its advance deeper into Frankish territory. Although Muslim rule remained secure in Spain, this victory became one of the defining moments of medieval European history. At the same time, Boniface was elevated as archbishop over much of Germany, strengthening the influence of the Roman Church across Central Europe. Mercia reached the height of its power under Ethelbald during the 730s. Contemporary writers described him as the leading ruler of southern Britain, while his authority extended over many neighboring kingdoms. Yet his dominance faced growing resistance. The Britons won several important victories, and conflicts with Northumbria and the Picts continued almost without interruption. Religious life flourished despite the wars. Monasteries multiplied across Britain and Ireland, and scholars such as Bede and Boniface shaped the intellectual life of Western Europe. After Bede's death in 735, his writings quickly became some of the most influential historical works of the Middle Ages. The following decades witnessed renewed struggles for supremacy. Mercia built massive frontier defenses, including the beginnings of Offa's Dyke, while successive kings fought to control Kent, Sussex, East Anglia, and the Welsh borderlands. In the north, Pictish and Northumbrian rulers battled repeatedly for dominance, while the Britons of Alt-Clut continued resisting both their Pictish and Anglian neighbors. The rise of Charlemagne transformed continental politics. After becoming sole ruler of the Franks, he expanded his kingdom, established the Breton March to defend his western frontier, and forged new diplomatic relationships across Europe. Britain also felt his growing influence as several English rulers sought alliances with the Frankish court. During the late 700s and 70s, Mercia reached the peak of its influence under Offa. He conquered neighboring kingdoms, strengthened royal administration, and promoted major church reforms. At the Synod of Chelsea, the English Church was reorganized, while the Seventh Ecumenical Council at Nicaea restored the veneration of icons and condemned iconoclasm, resolving one of the greatest theological controversies of the age. Another era began in 789 when 3 ships from Norway landed on the Dorset coast. The encounter ended with the death of a local official, becoming the first recorded Viking raid on the British Isles. Few at the time realized that this small attack marked the beginning of the Viking Age, a period that would transform Britain, Ireland, and much of Europe over the next 3 centuries. The final years of the century were marked by both achievement and tragedy. Viking raids intensified, culminating in the devastating attack on Lindisfarne in 793, which shocked the Christian world. Offa strengthened coastal defenses and founded new monasteries, while political struggles continued across Northumbria, Mercia, and Kent. Charlemagne expanded his influence across Western Europe, and in the year 800, Pope Leo III crowned him emperor in Rome, reviving the idea of a Western Roman Empire. Soon afterward, Ecgbert became King of Wessex and began the long campaign that would eventually unite much of England. As the 9th century approached, Britain stood at the crossroads of two great forces: the rise of powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the growing threat of Viking expansion that would soon reshape the history of the islands forever. The early 9th century was a time of enormous political change as Britain faced growing Viking attacks while new kingdoms struggled for dominance. In 803, an important church council abolished the independent Archbishopric of Lichfield, restoring Canterbury as the leading religious authority in England. Only a few years later, tragedy struck the monastery of Iona when Viking raiders slaughtered dozens of monks. Survivors escaped to Ireland, carrying with them the magnificent illuminated manuscript now known as the Book of Kells, preserving one of the greatest masterpieces of early medieval art. Northumbria remained trapped in political instability. Rival kings repeatedly seized the throne through rebellion, exile, and foreign support. One claimant even returned with the backing of Charlemagne and Pope Leo III, reclaiming the crown after driving out his rival. Across Britain, Welsh kingdoms also experienced frequent struggles for succession, while Mercia and Wessex competed for influence over their neighbours. The Viking threat grew steadily stronger. Danish fleets appeared along the Cornish coast, sometimes forming temporary alliances with the native Britons against Wessex. Monasteries including St. David's, Bangor, and Iona suffered repeated attacks, while new Viking settlements were founded at Limerick and later Dublin. These raids gradually evolved from quick coastal assaults into permanent attempts at colonization. Meanwhile, Europe itself was changing. Following the death of Charlemagne in 814, his son Louis the Pious inherited the Frankish Empire, but soon faced revolts in Brittany and internal political divisions. Breton leaders fought for greater independence, while Frankish armies repeatedly campaigned across the region. Eventually, local rulers secured considerable autonomy, laying the foundations of medieval Brittany. In southern Britain, King Ecgbert of Wessex transformed the balance of power. His campaigns against Cornwall and Mercia steadily expanded West Saxon influence. By defeating Mercia at the Battle of Elendun in 825, he ended decades of Mercian supremacy. Kent, Sussex, Essex, and East Anglia either submitted to Wessex or entered alliances with it, making Ecgbert the most powerful ruler in England. At the same time, the Welsh kingdoms fought to preserve their independence. Powys successfully resisted several Mercian invasions, while Gwynedd experienced dynastic struggles before Merfyn secured the throne and established a new royal dynasty. Around this period, the monk Nennius compiled the Historia Britonum, preserving many early traditions about Britain's past, including some of the earliest surviving accounts of Arthur. Beyond Britain, Viking activity expanded dramatically. Scandinavian fleets attacked Ireland, Frisia, and northern France, while continuing to raid monasteries throughout the British Isles. In 829, Ecgbert briefly brought Mercia under his direct control and forced Northumbria to acknowledge his authority, becoming the first ruler recognized as overlord of nearly all Anglo-Saxon England. The 830s witnessed an even greater escalation of Viking warfare. Danish armies attacked Cornwall, East Anglia, Mercia, and Wessex almost every year. Although Ecgbert defeated a combined Cornish and Viking force at Hingston Down in 838, the Scandinavian threat continued growing. During these same years, Pictish kings battled both Vikings and neighboring kingdoms, while Irish rulers struggled to maintain authority as Norse settlements spread along the coast. In 841, Viking leader Thorgest established a permanent settlement at Dublin, creating what would become one of the most important Norse cities in Western Europe. From there, Viking fleets launched increasingly ambitious expeditions throughout Ireland and Britain. Monasteries such as Clonmacnoise and wealthy trading centres became regular targets, while Scandinavian influence spread deeper inland. Political changes also transformed continental Europe. Following the death of Louis the Pious, the Treaty of Verdun in 843 divided Charlemagne's empire among his sons. The vast Carolingian realm split into Western, Eastern, and Middle kingdoms, laying the foundations for the future states of France and Germany. During the same period, Brittany expanded under Nominoé and his successors, defeating Frankish armies and strengthening Breton independence. Britain itself entered another new era. Rhodri Mawr became King of Gwynedd and gradually emerged as one of the greatest Welsh rulers of the early Middle Ages. In northern Britain, rival claimants struggled for control of Pictland and Dalriata, while the foundations of the future Kingdom of Alba slowly began to take shape. The Viking world continued expanding at remarkable speed. Scandinavian fleets raided the coasts of France, sailed up major rivers such as the Loire and Garonne, and attacked cities as far south as Seville. Meanwhile, the Byzantine Empire entered what historians later called the Macedonian Renaissance, a period of renewed cultural and political strength despite continued external threats. By the middle of the 9th century, Britain had become a land shaped by three powerful forces. Wessex was rising toward dominance under the descendants of Ecgbert, Viking settlements were becoming permanent features of the landscape, and the remaining Brittonic kingdoms fought to preserve their independence. At the same time, Europe itself was being reshaped by the division of the Carolingian Empire, the growth of Viking power, and the emergence of new medieval kingdoms that would define the centuries ahead. The middle of the 9th century was an age of relentless Viking expansion, rising kingdoms, and shifting alliances across Britain and Western Europe. In 845, the Breton leader Nominoé secured a decisive victory over Charles the Bald at the Battle of Ballon, effectively uniting Brittany under a single ruler for the first time. His triumph established the foundations of an independent Breton kingdom, while the Franks were forced to acknowledge his authority. During the same period, Viking fleets under the legendary Ragnar Lodbrok sailed deep into the River Seine, plundering towns along the way and even threatening Paris before accepting a large payment to withdraw. Britain also remained under constant pressure. Local Anglo-Saxon leaders successfully defeated several Danish raids in southern England, but Viking attacks became more frequent each year. Welsh kingdoms continued fighting among themselves, while Scotland experienced major political change. The Pictish kingdom gradually shifted its center of power toward the Tay Valley, under new rulers who strengthened royal authority and reorganized both government and the church. At the same time, Irish kings won important victories over Norse armies, temporarily slowing Viking expansion across Ireland. The Vikings showed little sign of retreat. Their fleets devastated Bordeaux, raided the Lower Rhine, and attacked settlements throughout Britain and Ireland. Monasteries remained favorite targets because of their wealth, while trading towns suffered repeated destruction. Yet even amid this violence, cultural life continued. Around 850, important monuments were raised in Wales celebrating native dynasties, while church leaders in Cornwall and southern Britain strengthened ties with Canterbury, helping maintain religious unity despite political fragmentation. A major turning point arrived in 851 when Nominoé died during his campaign against the Franks. His son Erispoa carried on the struggle and defeated Charles the Bald once again at the Battle of Camlann. The peace that followed greatly expanded Breton territory and effectively recognized Brittany as an independent kingdom. At the same time, an enormous Viking fleet entered the River Thames and invaded southern England. King Ethelwulf of Wessex responded with one of the greatest victories of his reign, defeating the invaders at the Battle of Aclea and halting what could have become a catastrophic invasion. Political alliances became increasingly important during the following years. Mercia strengthened its relationship with Wessex through royal marriage, while Viking armies founded new settlements, including Waterford in Ireland. Across France, Scandinavian fleets sailed up major rivers, attacking monasteries and prosperous towns with alarming speed. Although Frankish rulers repeatedly paid Danegeld to buy peace, these payments only encouraged further Viking expeditions. Religion also played a growing role in politics. King Ethelwulf undertook a famous pilgrimage to Rome, taking his young son Alfred with him. Before leaving, he granted extensive privileges to the church and donated a tenth of his own lands strengthening royal ties with Christianity. During his absence, however, political tensions emerged within Wessex, forcing him to accept a compromise that divided authority between himself and his ambitious son Ethelbald. Meanwhile, Wales experienced a dramatic revival under Rhodri Mawr. After defeating a major Viking invasion in 856 and killing its leader, Rhodri secured control over both Gwynedd and Powys, becoming the most powerful Welsh ruler of his generation. His victories earned admiration far beyond Britain and demonstrated that Viking armies were not invincible. Elsewhere, Breton politics turned violent when Erispoe was assassinated by his cousin Salamon, who soon became king with Frankish recognition. Viking attacks nevertheless continued across northern France, while Scandinavian leaders such as Rorik expanded their influence in Denmark and Frisia. Throughout these years, raids reached cities including Paris, Orléans, Beauvais, and Amiens, forcing Frankish rulers to strengthen river defenses and construct fortified bridges to protect the heart of their kingdom. The death of Ethelwulf in 858 brought another transition in England. His son, Ethelbald, became king of Wessex, while his brother Ethelbert ruled Kent and neighboring territories. Before long, the kingdoms were reunited under a single crown, strengthening Wessex at a time when Viking attacks were becoming increasingly dangerous. Around the same period, the descendants of the Scottish king Synaed mac Ailpin strengthened their influence through dynastic marriages that linked the royal houses of Scotland, Strathclyde, and Ireland. Viking activity expanded far beyond the British Isles. Bjorn Ironside and Hastein led spectacular expeditions through the Mediterranean, attacking coastal cities from Spain to Italy before returning north with enormous wealth. In France, the Danish leader Wayland repeatedly attacked major towns before eventually negotiating with Charles the Bald, illustrating how Viking commanders could shift between warfare and diplomacy whenever it suited their interests. The early 860s brought important political reforms throughout Western Europe. Charles the Bald organized new frontier regions to defend against Viking attacks, appointing capable military governors to guard the approaches to Brittany and Normandy. Despite these efforts, Viking raids continued almost every year, reaching Paris, Cologne, Aachen, and many other important cities. Some Scandinavian leaders accepted Christianity and entered Frankish service, while others continued plundering across the continent. At the same time, events in Eastern Europe would shape history for centuries. The Varangian leader Rurik established himself at Novgorod, laying the foundations of the Rus's state and beginning the dynasty that would eventually rule Russia for hundreds of years. Meanwhile, relations between Rome and Constantinople deteriorated during the Photian Schism, one of the earliest major disputes between the Eastern and Western churches. By the middle of the 9th century, Britain and Europe had entered a new age. Wessex was steadily emerging as the strongest Anglo-Saxon kingdom, Brittany had secured its independence, Viking settlements had become permanent across Ireland and northern Europe, and powerful Scandinavian fleets dominated the seas. Old Roman traditions still survived in law, religion, and government, but the political landscape was now being shaped by ambitious medieval kingdoms and the unstoppable rise of the Viking world. The second half of the 9th century transformed Britain more dramatically than any period since the end of Roman rule. In 865, the famous Great Heathen Army, commanded by the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lodbrok, landed in East Anglia. Unlike earlier Viking raiders who came only to plunder, this force intended to conquer and settle. After securing horses and supplies from the East Anglians, the army marched inland, beginning a campaign that would reshape the political future of England. At the same time, the kingdoms of Britain struggled with their own conflicts. Mercia launched another invasion of Gwynedd, but was forced to withdraw as the Viking threat grew more urgent. In Wessex, King Ethelbert died and was succeeded by his brother, Ethelred I, who immediately faced the greatest military challenge of his reign. The Vikings quickly turned north, invading Northumbria and capturing the great city of York. Rival kings Osbert and Ella temporarily united to reclaim their kingdom, but in 867 they suffered a crushing defeat. Both rulers were killed, and the Danes installed a puppet king while tightening their grip on York. This victory effectively ended Northumbria as an independent Anglo-Saxon power and established Jorvik as one of the most important Viking centers in Britain. Having secured the north, the great heathen army advanced into Mercia. King Burgred appealed to Wessex for assistance, and Ethelred, supported by his younger brother Alfred, marched north to help. Although they prevented an immediate conquest, the Danes remained firmly established, forcing the English kingdoms into an exhausting struggle that would last for years. In 869, the Vikings invaded East Anglia once again. King Edmund refused to submit and fought against overwhelming odds. He was defeated, captured, and executed after refusing to abandon his Christian faith. His death quickly turned him into one of England's most revered saints, while East Anglia became another Viking-controlled kingdom. The following years brought relentless warfare. Viking armies destroyed the fortress of Altclut after a long siege, forcing the kingdom of Strathclyde to move its political center farther south. Reinforced by the arrival of another Scandinavian force known as the Great Summer Army, the invaders pushed deep into Wessex, capturing Reading and using it as a base for further campaigns. The year 871 became one of the most dramatic in English history. Within only a few months, Wessex fought a series of desperate battles against the Danes. Although Alfred won a spectacular victory at Ashdown by breaking through the Viking shield wall, later defeats at Basing and Merton left the kingdom exhausted. When King Ethelred died, Alfred inherited the throne under the worst possible circumstances. Recognizing that continued fighting would destroy Wessex, he agreed to pay tribute to buy valuable time while preparing for future resistance. Elsewhere, Welsh fortunes improved under Rhodri Mawr, who united much of northern Wales and strengthened his kingdom through military victories. In Scotland, the growing kingdom of Alba expanded into neighboring territories weakened by repeated Viking attacks, laying the foundations of medieval Scotland. The Great Heathen Army continued its advance after 872, crushing rebellions in Northumbria before moving south again. Mercia finally collapsed in 874 when King Burgred was driven into exile and replaced by a ruler loyal to the Danes. From this point onward, much of eastern and northern England fell under Viking domination, while the conquerors divided conquered lands among their own leaders and settlers. Meanwhile, events beyond Britain were equally significant. Iceland received its first permanent Norse settlers, led by Ingolfur Arnarsson, who founded what became Reykjavik. In Norway, Harald Fairhair extended his authority over Orkney and Shetland, bringing many northern islands under Norwegian influence for centuries to come. The struggle in Britain was far from over. Viking armies continued attacking Wessex, repeatedly capturing important fortresses and threatening Alfred's kingdom. Storms destroyed part of one invading fleet, but Guthrum and his warriors remained a dangerous force. In the north, Halfdan formally established the Viking kingdom of Jorvik, while Scandinavian settlers spread across large areas of northern England. The Welsh also endured renewed invasions. Rhodri Mawr was eventually defeated and forced into temporary exile in Ireland, allowing rival rulers to recover lost territories. At the same time, Viking leaders fought one another for supremacy in Ireland, while Danish-controlled Mercia was divided into fortified districts governed by Scandinavian jarls. By the late 870s, England had been transformed. Northumbria, East Anglia, and much of Mercia were under Viking rule, creating the region that later became known as the Danelaw. Only Wessex remained as the last major independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom. Surrounded by powerful enemies yet determined to survive, Alfred began rebuilding his strength. His struggle against the Great Heathen Army would soon become one of the defining chapters in the history of medieval Britain, laying the foundations for the future Kingdom of England. By the closing years of the 9th century, the struggle between the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the Vikings had reached a decisive stage. In 893, Danish armies led by the experienced warrior Hastein launched another major invasion of England. Viking fleets sailed around the southern coast, attacking Devon and besieging Exeter, while Hastein established heavily fortified camps in Essex. Alfred the Great responded with remarkable speed, coordinating forces from Wessex, Mercia, and their Welsh allies. At the Battle of Buttington, the English surrounded a large Viking army, cutting off its supplies until the starving survivors fought their way out and retreated to Danish-controlled East Anglia. Although the war continued, Alfred had once again prevented the conquest of his kingdom. These campaigns also revealed Alfred's growing military genius. He strengthened fortified towns, improved communications between regional commanders, and reorganized his army into rotating forces that could respond rapidly to Viking movements. Around the same time, the Welsh ruler, Anarod of Gwynedd, abandoned his unstable alliance with the Vikings and accepted Alfred as his overlord. Their agreement brought military cooperation and marked one of the first major political partnerships between Wessex and a Welsh kingdom. The fighting continued through the following years. Viking forces repeatedly attempted to seize Exeter and Chichester, but were repelled by determined English defenders. Alfred then introduced one of his most innovative military reforms by constructing larger and stronger warships specifically designed to challenge Viking longships at sea. Although naval warfare remained difficult, these ships represented the beginning of a permanent English navy. By 897, the tide had clearly begun to turn. English ships intercepted Viking fleets along the southern coast, capturing several vessels and destroying others before they could escape. Many Scandinavian raiders abandoned hopes of conquering Wessex and instead returned to East Anglia or crossed the Channel to the continent. Alfred had survived the greatest challenge of his reign and secured the future of his kingdom. Preparing for a stable succession, Alfred made his son Edward a partner in government before his own death in 899. Remembered as one of the greatest rulers in English history, Alfred left behind not only a stronger kingdom, but also military, legal, and educational reforms that would influence England for centuries. Edward the Elder inherited both the throne and the responsibility of completing his father's work. His accession was immediately challenged by his cousin Ethelwald, who claimed the throne for himself. After briefly occupying royal estates in Dorset, Ethelwald fled north and gained the support of the Danish rulers of Northumbria and East Anglia. Civil war seemed possible, but Edward acted quickly to secure loyalty throughout Wessex while preparing for a larger conflict with the Vikings. Around the same period, important changes were taking place elsewhere in Britain. In Scotland, Constantine II became King of Alba, marking the gradual transition from the old Pictish kingdom toward the medieval Scottish state. To the southwest, the Kingdom of Strathclyde expanded into lands weakened by Viking attacks, and chroniclers increasingly referred to its people as the Cumbrians. Norse settlers also occupied large areas of Cumbria and Lancashire, permanently changing the ethnic landscape of northern Britain. The Viking world itself was undergoing major transformations. In Ireland, Norse rulers were temporarily driven from Dublin before many resettled along the Wirral Peninsula in northwestern England. Others attempted to establish themselves in Wales, but met determined resistance from local rulers. Viking leaders continued to launch raids throughout Britain, yet internal rivalries increasingly divided their strength. Edward gradually shifted from defense to counterattack. Together with his sister, Ethelflaed, the remarkable Lady of the Mercians, he began systematically recovering Danish-held territory. While Edward strengthened southern England, Ethelflaed rebuilt key fortresses, repaired ancient Roman defenses, and constructed new fortified towns known as burhs. These strongholds became the backbone of the English reconquest. The political map of Wales also changed dramatically. Hywel Dda expanded his influence through both warfare and marriage, eventually uniting several Welsh kingdoms under his leadership. His reputation would later rest not only on military success, but also on his famous legal reforms, which became some of the most respected laws in medieval Wales. Religious life flourished despite the constant warfare. New abbeys were founded across southern England, churches adopted continental customs, and bishoprics were reorganized to strengthen ecclesiastical administration. Edward and Ethelflaed also recovered the relics of St. Oswald and established them at Gloucester, turning the city into one of the kingdom's most important religious centers. The decisive breakthrough came in 910 at the Battle of Wednesfield. Edward's forces, joined by Mercian armies, inflicted a crushing defeat on the Viking rulers of York. Several leading Danish kings were killed, ending their ability to launch large-scale invasions into southern England. Although the Viking kingdom of York survived, its power was permanently weakened. Following the death of Mercian ruler Ethelred, Ethelfled assumed control in her own right, becoming one of the most extraordinary female rulers of the early Middle Ages. Working closely with Edward, she led campaigns that steadily reclaimed the Danelaw, capturing important towns such as Derby, while Edward advanced through eastern England. Together, brother and sister transformed the balance of power, replacing centuries of Viking expansion with an organized English reconquest. Meanwhile, events across Europe continued reshaping the medieval world. In 911, the Viking leader Rollo accepted land from the Frankish king Charles the Simple, establishing the Duchy of Normandy. Rather than remaining raiders, the Normans gradually became one of Europe's most powerful ruling dynasties. At almost the same time, Viking attacks intensified in Brittany, while Edward and Ethelflaed continued their relentless advance against the Danelaw, laying the foundations for the eventual unification of England under the House of Wessex. The early 10th century marked the beginning of England's remarkable recovery from the Viking invasions. In 918, Ethelflaed, the legendary Lady of the Mercians, continued leading the struggle against Danish rule alongside her brother Edward the Elder. Together, they coordinated campaigns across the Midlands, while also securing alliances with Welsh rulers and the Kingdom of Alba. Although battles against Viking leaders such as Ragnar ended without a decisive result, English influence continued to expand. Before long, both Hywel Dda of Wales and Idwal of Gwynedd acknowledged Edward's authority, recognizing Wessex as the dominant power in Britain. Ethelfled herself died later that year after a lifetime spent defending Mercia, ending one of the most remarkable careers of the early Middle Ages. Edward quickly absorbed Mercia into his own kingdom after removing Ethelflaed's daughter, Elfwin, from power. With England becoming increasingly united, the king turned his attention toward the remaining Viking territories. At the same time, Norse forces from the Loire captured Brittany, forcing many Breton nobles into exile across the English Channel. One of them, the young Alain, found refuge at the English court, where he would later prepare to reclaim his homeland. Meanwhile, Wales experienced important political change. Hywel Dda united the kingdoms of Dyfed and Ceredigion, creating the powerful realm later known as Deheubarth. Unlike many contemporary rulers, Hywel became famous not only for military success, but also for wise government and legal reform, establishing a reputation that endured for centuries. Edward's military campaigns steadily weakened Viking resistance. Fortified towns were built throughout southern England, old Roman defenses were repaired, and Danish settlements were gradually surrounded. Rather than relying solely on battlefield victories, Edward and his commanders used a network of strong burhs to isolate Viking territories until they could no longer resist. Following Edward's death in 924, his son Ethelstan inherited the throne. His reign soon transformed the political landscape of Britain. He strengthened ties with neighboring rulers, welcomed exiled nobles from Brittany, and expanded English authority farther west. By 926, Cornwall had been incorporated into the English kingdom, while the frontier with Wales was formally recognized along the River Wye. A defining moment came in 927 when several of Britain's most powerful rulers, including Constantine II of Alba, Owain of Cumbria, Hywel Dda, and other Welsh kings, met Ethelstan at Amont Bridge. They acknowledged his supremacy, allowing him to adopt the title King of the English and, in Latin, King of all Britain. Many historians regard this event as the true beginning of a unified Kingdom of England. Across Europe, dramatic events unfolded at the same time. In 929, Abd al-Rahman III proclaimed himself Caliph of Cordoba, making Muslim Spain one of the most powerful and sophisticated states in Europe. In the far north, Iceland established the Althing, one of the world's oldest surviving parliamentary institutions. Meanwhile, Breton resistance against Viking occupation steadily gathered strength under leaders determined to reclaim their homeland. During the early 930s, Welsh rulers continued appearing at Ethelstan's royal court, acknowledging his authority while maintaining considerable independence. Rollo, founder of Normandy, died and was succeeded by his son William Longsword, whose dynasty would later play a decisive role in English history. Ethelstan also demonstrated his military strength by launching a large expedition into Scotland in 934. Supported by Welsh allies and even Danish forces from eastern England, he advanced deep into Scottish territory while his fleet raided the northern coast. Although the campaign produced no permanent conquest, it clearly established England as the strongest kingdom in Britain. By 936, the border between England and Cornwall had been fixed along the river Tamar, while Brittany experienced its own revival. Alain Barbetort returned from exile in England, drove out the Viking occupiers, and restored an independent Breton duchy, though with somewhat reduced territory. The greatest military achievement of Æthelstan's reign came in 937 at the famous Battle of Brunanburh. A massive alliance of Vikings from Dublin, the Scots under Constantine II, and the Britons of Cumbria attempted to destroy English power. Instead, Æthelstan won one of the most decisive victories in medieval British history. Contemporary writers celebrated the battle as unmatched since the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons, and it firmly secured England as the dominant kingdom of the island. Despite the victory, peace remained fragile. After Æthelstan's death in 939, Olaf Guthfrithson quickly seized York, forcing the new king, Edmund I, into renewed conflict. Meanwhile, Cumbria reached the height of its influence, and Welsh rulers continued balancing cooperation with resistance against English authority. Edmund gradually reversed Viking gains. He recovered the 5 boroughs, re-established English control over Northumbria, and campaigned successfully against both Cumbria and Scotland. During these years, Hywel united nearly all of Wales under his leadership and introduced his famous legal code, creating one of medieval Europe's most respected systems of law. Political fortunes changed once again after Edmund was murdered in 946. His brother Edred inherited the throne and continued the struggle against the Viking kings of York. Repeated campaigns finally ended Scandinavian rule there, and in 954 the Kingdom of Jorvik collapsed. For the first time in generations, all of England came under a single ruler, effectively ending the Viking Age as a political force within the country. The following years brought important internal reforms. Church leaders such as St. Dunstan began reorganizing English monastic life, while the kingdoms of Scotland, Wales, and Brittany experienced their own dynastic changes. By the early 960s, King Edgar the Peaceful reunited England after a brief period of division and supported sweeping religious reforms that strengthened royal authority alongside the church. At the same time, Otto I was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 962, creating the Holy Roman Empire and ushering in a new political era across medieval Europe. By the middle of the 10th century, England had emerged stronger than ever before. The Viking kingdoms had largely disappeared, royal authority had expanded across nearly the entire island, and powerful rulers such as Æthelstan, Edmund, Edred, and Edgar had transformed a collection of competing kingdoms into a far more unified English state. Their achievements laid the foundations for the medieval Kingdom of England that would dominate British history in the centuries ahead. The second half of the 10th century witnessed the rise of powerful kingdoms, renewed Viking expansion, and major political transformations across Britain and Europe. In 965, Muslim forces completed their conquest of Sicily, ending Byzantine rule on the island. In response, the Eastern Roman Empire reorganized its remaining territories in southern Italy under a stronger military administration. Meanwhile, in England, Bishop Ethelwald restored the old monastery of Medeshamstede as a great Benedictine abbey, later known as Peterborough, becoming one of the leading religious centers of Anglo-Saxon England. Across the Irish Sea, a new struggle was beginning. Brian Boru, an ambitious ruler from Munster, launched a long campaign against the Norse kingdoms that dominated Ireland's coast. After winning a decisive victory at the Battle of Sulcoit in 968, he destroyed the Viking stronghold of Limerick, beginning his steady rise toward becoming the most powerful king in Ireland. Scotland also experienced repeated changes of leadership. Rival branches of the royal family competed for the throne, with kings frequently overthrown or killed in battle. Despite this instability, Scottish rulers strengthened alliances with neighboring kingdoms, including the rulers of Cumbria and the Isles, hoping to balance the growing influence of England. The reign of King Edgar the Peaceful marked one of the high points of Anglo-Saxon England. In 973, he was crowned in a magnificent ceremony at Bath, before gathering many of Britain's leading rulers at Chester. Kings from Scotland, Cumbria, Wales, and the Isles acknowledged his authority and pledged cooperation, symbolizing England's growing political dominance. Although these rulers remained independent, Edgar's prestige was unmatched anywhere in Britain. During his reign, the influential churchman Ethelwald completed the Regularis Concordia, a set of monastic reforms that helped standardize Benedictine life throughout England. Following Edgar's death in 975, political uncertainty returned. His son Edward, later remembered as Edward the Martyr, inherited the throne but ruled only briefly before being assassinated in 978. His younger half-brother, Ethelred II, became king while still a child, leaving much of the government in the hands of powerful nobles and his mother. This weak beginning would have lasting consequences for England. At almost the same time, Scandinavian raiders resumed attacks after more than 2 decades of relative peace. Beginning around 980, Danish fleets repeatedly struck southern England, ravaging Hampshire, Thanet, Cheshire, Devon, Cornwall, and Dorset. These raids signaled the return of a serious Viking threat that English rulers had hoped was over. Elsewhere, remarkable discoveries were taking place. Eric the Red sailed west and established the first permanent Norse settlements in Greenland, while a few years later the Icelandic explorer Bjarni Herjolfsson became the first known European since the legendary voyage of St. Brendan to sight the North American mainland. His discovery inspired later expeditions across the Atlantic. The political map of Western Europe also changed dramatically in 987 when Hugh Capet became king, founding the Capetian dynasty that would rule France for centuries. Around the same period, Byzantine Emperor Basil II created the famous Varangian Guard, an elite unit composed largely of Scandinavian warriors who served as the emperor's personal bodyguard and became renowned for their loyalty and battlefield skill. England, however, faced increasing danger. In 991, Olaf Tryggvason led a major Viking expedition up the Thames. The English confronted him at the Battle of Maldon, where the heroic Ealdorman Byrhtnoth was killed after a fierce struggle. Unable to stop further destruction, King Ethelred agreed to pay a large tribute known as Danegeld, hoping to persuade the Vikings to leave. Instead, the payment encouraged even more expeditions. Olaf later became King of Norway and promoted Christianity throughout his kingdom, while England continued suffering repeated raids. Around the same time, the bishopric of Lindisfarne was transferred to Durham, creating a new religious center protected by stronger natural defenses. The future city of Durham soon grew around its cathedral and monastery. The closing years of the century brought still greater turmoil. Danish fleets established winter camps in southwest England, raiding Cornwall, Devon, Somerset, Sussex, and Kent before eventually returning to Normandy. In Ireland, Brian Boru achieved another major triumph at the Battle of Glenmama in 999, defeating the combined armies of Leinster and Viking Dublin. His victory placed him in a position to dominate nearly the whole island. At the dawn of the new millennium, Norse exploration reached an extraordinary milestone. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson crossed the Atlantic and established a settlement in Vinland, on the coast of modern Newfoundland. His expeditions also explored regions later known as Markland and Helluland, making the Norse the first known Europeans to reach North America centuries before Columbus. Meanwhile, Viking attacks on England intensified. In 1001, Danish armies defeated English forces in Devon and burned settlements to spread fear throughout the southwest. The following year, Brian Boru was widely recognized as High King of Ireland after securing the submission of rival rulers, earning titles that celebrated him as the supreme ruler of the Irish and their allies. England faced perhaps its most controversial moment in 1002. Seeking to eliminate the growing Danish presence within his kingdom, King Ethelred ordered the massacre of many Danes living in England on St. Brice's Day. Among those reportedly killed was Gunhild, the sister of King Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark. Rather than solving England's problems, the massacre provoked Sweyn into launching a series of full-scale invasions that would eventually overthrow Ethelred's rule. By the opening years of the 11th century, Viking armies were once again ravaging England, while Sweyn expanded his influence across the country. At the same time, Brian Boru strengthened his authority in Ireland, Scotland continued experiencing dynastic struggles, and France, Normandy, and the Byzantine Empire entered new periods of political development. Britain now stood on the edge of another era of conquest, one that would soon bring Danish kings to the English throne and permanently reshape the history of the British Isles. The opening decades of the 11th century marked one of the most dramatic periods in British history as Viking invasions reached their peak and the Danish kings transformed England forever. In 1006, King Sweyn Forkbeard led another devastating campaign across southern England. His armies marched from the Isle of Wight deep into the Thames Valley, destroying towns and villages before settling into winter camps. At the same time, Scotland's King Malcolm II invaded Northumbria, but his advance was stopped by the rising warrior Uhtred of Bambur. Rewarded for his victory, Uhtred became the dominant noble of northern England and laid the foundations of the powerful earldom of Northumbria. Unable to stop the constant invasions, King Ethelred the Unready once again paid enormous sums of Danegeld in 1007 to persuade the Vikings to leave. The strategy brought only temporary peace. Around the same period, the famous Book of Kells was stolen from its monastery but was fortunately recovered, although its magnificent jeweled cover had disappeared forever. Determined to strengthen England's defenses, Ethelred also ordered the construction of a massive new fleet, hoping to challenge the Danes at sea. The plan failed to halt the invasion. By 1009, Sweyn's warriors had returned in force, while the legendary Jomsviking commander Thorkel the Tall arrived with another powerful fleet. Southern England endured years of destruction as Viking armies burned settlements and captured rich cities. In 1011, after a long siege, Canterbury fell. The city was plundered, and Archbishop Elfhere was taken prisoner. When he refused to allow a ransom to be paid for his freedom, drunken Viking warriors murdered him despite Thorkel's attempts to save his life. Shocked by the brutality, Thorkel eventually abandoned Sweyn and entered the service of King Ethelred. At the same time, events in Ireland were moving toward an equally decisive conflict. Brian Boru, High King of Ireland, faced rebellion from the King of Leinster and his Viking allies in Dublin. Scotland also strengthened its position as Malcolm II defeated another Danish army, demonstrating that not every Viking expedition ended in victory. Everything changed in 1013 when Sweyn Forkbeard launched a full-scale invasion with his son Cnut. One kingdom after another submitted until nearly all of England accepted Danish rule. Ethelred fled to Normandy with his family, leaving Sweyn to become the first Danish king to rule the whole of England. Wales, Scotland, and Cornwall remained outside his direct control but accepted his supremacy through tribute, creating the vast North Sea Empire that linked England, Denmark, and Norway. Sweyn's triumph was short-lived. He died suddenly in early 1014, allowing Ethelred to return from exile while Cnut temporarily withdrew. That same year, Ireland witnessed one of its greatest battles. At Clontarf, Brian Boru defeated a coalition of Dublin Vikings, the King of Leinster, and their allies from Orkney and the Isle of Man. Although Brian won the battle, he was killed before the fighting ended, becoming one of Ireland's greatest national heroes. His death left the High Kingship once again open to rivalry. Cnut refused to abandon his ambitions. In 1015, he returned with an enormous Scandinavian army drawn from across the Viking world. Around the same time, Olaf Haraldsson declared himself King of Norway, while Scandinavian rulers continued reshaping the politics of Northern Europe. The decisive struggle for England followed in 1016. After Ethelred died, the country split between supporters of his son Edmund Ironside and those backing Cnut. Edmund fought a brilliant campaign, winning several victories and temporarily lifting the siege of London. However, the crucial Battle of Asandun gave Cnut a decisive victory. The two rivals agreed to divide England, but Edmund died only weeks later, leaving Cnut as the undisputed ruler. Cnut quickly secured his new kingdom. He removed powerful rivals, reorganized England into 4 great earldoms, and strengthened his alliance with Normandy by marrying Emma, the widow of Ethelred. His reign combined Danish military strength with established Anglo-Saxon institutions, creating one of the most stable governments England had seen for generations. Meanwhile, Scotland continued expanding. In 1018, Malcolm II defeated the Northumbrians at the Battle of Camlann, permanently bringing Lothian under Scottish control. The victory became one of the defining moments in the formation of medieval Scotland. During the same period, Cnut inherited the Danish throne after the death of his brother Harold, uniting England and Denmark under one ruler, while later extending his authority into Norway as well. Cnut devoted much of his reign to law, administration, and diplomacy rather than constant warfare. He revised English laws, strengthened royal government, restored churches damaged during earlier conflicts, and honored important saints such as Archbishop Elfheer by returning his remains to Canterbury. His court became one of the wealthiest and most influential in Northern Europe, attracting nobles, churchmen, and warriors from across the continent. Beyond Britain, Europe was also changing rapidly. The Byzantine Empire finally destroyed the First Bulgarian Empire after decades of warfare, while new kingdoms emerged across Scotland and southwestern Britain. Around the same time, Galloway developed into a distinct Norse Gaelic kingdom, reflecting the blending of Scandinavian and Celtic cultures. The final major conflict of this period came in 1026 at the Battle of Helgeå. Cnut's combined English and Danish fleet confronted an alliance between Sweden and Norway. His victory secured Danish dominance throughout much of Scandinavia and confirmed the North Sea Empire as the greatest political power in Northern Europe. By the mid-11th century, England had been transformed from a kingdom desperately resisting Viking invasion into the very center of a Scandinavian empire, a remarkable reversal that would shape the history of Britain for generations. The years between 1027 and 1051 witnessed the decline of the North Sea Empire, the rise of powerful new rulers, and major political changes across Britain and Europe. In 1027, the English dioceses of Crediton and St. Germans were united under a single bishop, reflecting the continued reorganization of the English Church. A year later, King Cnut the Great sailed from England to Norway, overthrowing Olaf II and bringing Norway under his growing empire. Although Olaf attempted to reclaim his throne in 1030, he was defeated and killed at the Battle of Stiklestad. His death transformed him into Saint Olaf, the patron saint of Norway and one of the most revered figures in Scandinavian history. Cnut's authority soon stretched across much of Northern Europe. In 1031, Malcolm II of Scotland, Macbeth of Moray, and the ruler of the Isles all acknowledged his supremacy. At roughly the same time, the once powerful Caliphate of Cordoba began breaking apart into rival states, marking the end of Muslim Spain's political unity. Scotland entered a turbulent period following the death of Malcolm II in 1034. Duncan I inherited the throne, while powerful regional nobles competed for influence. Among them was Macbeth, ruler of Moray, who strengthened his position after defeating rivals and marrying into the royal family. Contrary to the later image created by Shakespeare, Macbeth proved to be an able and respected king who encouraged stable government, welcomed Norman warriors into Scotland, and maintained peace for much of his reign. The death of Cnut in 1035 created another succession crisis. His sons, Harold Harefoot and Harthacnut, each claimed the English throne. Because Harthacnut remained in Denmark defending his kingdom, Harold assumed control of England. During these uncertain years, Alfred Etheling, the younger son of Ethelred the Unready, attempted to reclaim the crown but was captured, blinded, and killed. His brother Edward remained in Normandy, waiting for another opportunity to return. Political instability spread beyond England. Gruffydd ap Llywelyn emerged as the dominant ruler in Wales after defeating both internal rivals and invading English forces. His military victories allowed him to unite Gwynedd and Powys before expanding into Deheubarth, making him the strongest Welsh king of his generation. Scotland also faced repeated warfare, as Duncan I launched unsuccessful campaigns against Northumbria before eventually being defeated and killed in battle by Macbeth in 1040. The same year, Harthacnut finally reclaimed the English throne after Harold's death. Although his reign was short, he prepared the way for the peaceful return of Edward the Confessor, who had spent most of his life in exile in Normandy. Harthacnut, officially named Edward as his successor, ensuring that the old House of Wessex would once again rule England. When Harthacnut died suddenly in 1042, Edward became king without serious opposition. His accession marked the restoration of the ancient West Saxon dynasty after more than 25 years of Danish rule. Edward relied heavily on Norman advisors and soldiers, introducing stronger Norman influence into English politics decades before the Norman conquest itself. At the same time, Magnus the Good united Norway and Denmark for a brief period, becoming one of Scandinavia's most powerful rulers. Edward was crowned again in 1043 at Winchester, where he firmly established his authority. Suspecting that his mother Emma had supported rival claimants, he confiscated much of her wealth while allowing her to remain at court. 2 years later, he married Edith, daughter of the influential Earl Godwin, creating an alliance between the royal family and England's most powerful noble house. Harold Godwinson also rose rapidly during these years, receiving important earldoms that would later make him one of the kingdom's leading figures. Across Britain, Wales remained highly active under Gruffydd ap Llywelyn. Through a series of successful campaigns, he expanded his kingdom and repeatedly defeated English armies sent against him. Although temporary setbacks forced him from some territories, he consistently returned stronger than before, eventually becoming the only Welsh ruler ever to unite nearly all of Wales under a single crown. Meanwhile, the English Church continued evolving. The episcopal seat at Crediton was transferred to Exeter, strengthening the city's importance as a religious centre. Bishops reorganized dioceses, promoted learning, and established new liturgical traditions that distinguished the English Church while remaining loyal to Rome. Edward also became increasingly involved in continental affairs. He blockaded the English Channel during a conflict with Flanders and maintained close relations with Normandy. In 1051, tensions with Earl Godwin reached a breaking point after Edward blamed him for refusing to punish the people of Dover following a violent dispute involving Norman visitors. Godwin and much of his family were forced into exile, dramatically shifting the balance of power within England. During this same period, William, Duke of Normandy, consolidated his own authority by defeating rebellious nobles and expanding Norman influence across northern France. According to later Norman tradition, Edward invited William to England and privately suggested that he might one day inherit the English throne. Whether this promise was genuine remains debated, but it later became one of William's strongest claims when he launched his famous invasion in 1066. Edward also abolished the unpopular Danegeld, symbolizing his hope that the age of massive Viking invasions had finally come to an end. Yet, beneath the surface, powerful rival families, ambitious foreign rulers, and unresolved questions of succession continued to shape English politics. By the middle of the 11th century, Britain stood on the brink of another historic transformation, one that would soon culminate in one of the most famous conquests in medieval history. The middle of the 11th century was a period of intense rivalry, shifting alliances and approaching conquest across Britain. In 1052, the powerful Welsh ruler Gruffydd ap Llywelyn struck deep into English territory, raiding Herefordshire and sacking Leominster. At the same time, Earl Godwin returned from exile with a large fleet and sailed up the Thames, forcing King Edward the Confessor to restore him to his former position as Earl of Wessex. Godwin's return confirmed that the great noble families of England could challenge even the authority of the king. When Godwin died in 1053, his son Harold inherited the earldom of Wessex and quickly became the most influential man in England after the king. Harold also supported the return of Edward the Exile, a descendant of Edmund Ironside, hoping to strengthen the royal succession and prevent the throne from passing to a foreign claimant. In the north, Earl Siward of Northumbria launched a major invasion of Scotland in 1054. His campaign forced King Macbeth to retreat and temporarily restored Malcolm, a member of the Cumbrian royal family, to power in the borderlands. That same year, a far greater division shook Christianity. The leaders of the churches in Rome and Constantinople excommunicated one another, creating the Great Schism between the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox traditions. Gruffydd ap Llywelyn continued expanding his authority. In 1055, he conquered Deheubarth and formed an alliance with the exiled Mercian noble Elfgar, who was also his father-in-law. Supported by Viking ships from Ireland, their combined forces defeated the English near the Welsh frontier and devastated Hereford and Leominster. An English army led by the Bishop of Hereford was later destroyed at Glasbury-on-Wye. Harold Godwinson prepared another campaign against them, but ultimately chose negotiation rather than risk further losses. Political change also transformed Scotland. Macbeth was killed in 1057 while fighting the sons of Duncan I. His stepson Lulac briefly succeeded him, but was assassinated the following year by Malcolm Canmore, who became Malcolm III of Scotland. Macbeth's historical reign was far more stable than the violent tyranny later imagined in literature, and many contemporary traditions remembered him as a capable ruler rather than a murderous usurper. By 1058, Gruffydd ap Llywelyn had united nearly all of Wales. After conquering Gwent and Glywysing, he became the only ruler in the medieval period to control the entire Welsh territory under a single crown. His success made him a serious threat to English power along the western frontier. Harold Godwinson responded with a series of invasions between 1062 and 1063. He first attacked northern Wales and captured Gruffydd's stronghold at Rhuddlan, though the Welsh king escaped. The following year, Harold invaded from the south by sea, while his brother Tostig advanced from Northumbria. Surrounded and driven into the mountains of Snowdonia, Gruffydd was eventually betrayed and killed by his own followers. His united kingdom immediately broke apart into separate realms, ending the brief period of Welsh unity. Harold's growing influence soon extended beyond Britain. Between 1064 and 1066, he became involved in the conflict between Normandy and Brittany, supporting Duke William of Normandy. During this period, Harold was shipwrecked on the Norman coast and captured by the Count of Ponthieu. William secured his release, but reportedly compelled him to swear an oath supporting William's claim to the English throne. The meaning and circumstances of this oath later became one of the central arguments used to justify the Norman invasion. In 1065, rebellion broke out in Northumbria against Harold's brother Tostig. Rather than defend him, Harold supported the rebels and accepted Morcar as the new earl. Tostig fled to Flanders, bitterly blaming his brother for his downfall. This family division would have disastrous consequences only a year later. King Edward the Confessor died on January 5, 1066, leaving no direct heir. Several men claimed the throne. The English council selected Harold Godwinson, while Harold Hardrada of Norway and William of Normandy also believed they had legitimate rights to rule. Harold was crowned at Westminster immediately after Edward's funeral, becoming Harold II. The new king faced two invasions within weeks of one another. In September, Harold Hardrada landed in northern England with a large Norwegian army and the support of Tostig. After defeating the Earls Edwin and Morcar at Fulford, the Norwegians appeared close to taking York. Harold responded with extraordinary speed, marching his army north from London. On September 25th, he surprised and destroyed the Norwegian forces at Stamford Bridge. Hardrada and Tostig were both killed, ending the last major Scandinavian attempt to conquer England. Yet, the victory left Harold's army exhausted. Only 3 days later, William of Normandy landed on the southern coast with a large force of Normans, Bretons, and Flemings. Harold immediately marched south again, covering an enormous distance in little more than 2 weeks. On October 14th, the two armies met near Hastings. Harold positioned his infantry on the high ground of Senlac Hill, forming a strong shield wall of housecarls and local levies. William's army included archers, infantry, and heavily armed cavalry. For much of the day, the English line held firm, but repeated Norman attacks and false retreats gradually weakened its formation. By evening, Harold was dead, his brothers had fallen, and the English army had been destroyed. The Norman victory did not immediately guarantee control of the kingdom. The English council first elected Edgar Etheling, the last male descendant of the old royal house. However, as William advanced toward London, resistance collapsed. Edgar and the leading nobles submitted, and on Christmas Day, 1066, William was crowned King of England. The conquest transformed the political order of Britain. Norman castles appeared across the country, lands were transferred to foreign lords, and the Old English aristocracy was gradually removed from power. William returned briefly to Normandy in 1067, leaving his half-brother Odo of Bayeux to govern in his absence. Rebellions soon broke out in Kent, the north, and the Welsh borderlands, while the sons of Harold launched raids against Cornwall, Devon, and Somerset. The Welsh rulers Bledin and Rhiwallon supported English resistance along the frontier, but Norman armies rapidly created powerful new lordships in Chester and Hereford. These marcher lords received exceptional military authority and began pushing into Welsh territory. Gwent was among the first regions to suffer, as Norman forces defeated its rulers and established fortified bases. By the end of 1067, the Norman conquest was far from complete. But the old Anglo-Saxon kingdom had already been permanently changed. The struggle for England's throne had drawn in Norwegians, Normans, Bretons, Welsh rulers, and the surviving English nobility. The events of 1066 did not simply replace one king with another. They ended the Anglo-Saxon Age and opened a completely new chapter in the history of England and Britain. The years following the Norman conquest were marked by rebellion, destruction, and the rapid creation of a new political order across England and Wales. In 1068, Edgar Atheling, the last surviving male heir of the old House of Wessex, attempted to organize resistance against William the Conqueror. He was joined by major northern nobles, including Gospatric of Bernicia, Edwin of Mercia, and Morcar of York. The revolt failed, however, and William removed several of its leaders from power. Gospatric lost his earldom, which was handed to the Norman commander Robert de Comines. William returned from Normandy and immediately moved against opposition in the southwest. Exeter resisted him for 18 days before accepting a negotiated surrender. The city received relatively generous terms, but Norman control was firmly established. William appointed Brian of Brittany as the first Norman Earl of Cornwall and then marched north, crushing uprisings in Nottingham, Stafford, Lincoln, and York. Edgar Atheling escaped to the Scottish court of Malcolm III, accompanied by his sister Margaret. Many displaced Anglo-Saxons also fled westward into Wales. Their arrival influenced the political balance there, helping Bledin ap Cynfyn strengthen his position as sole ruler of Gwynedd and Powys. In the south, Maredudd ap Owain gained authority over much of Deheubarth. In 1069, Malcolm III married Edgar's sister Margaret, creating a powerful connection between the Scottish monarchy and the Old English royal house. That same year, resistance erupted again in northern England. The people of Northumbria killed Robert de Comines at Durham, while a Danish fleet under King Swine II arrived at the Humber and joined rebels in attacking York. The city's Norman castles and its ancient cathedral were burned. William responded with overwhelming force. He defeated another rebellion led by Edwin of Mercia and then faced a broader coalition involving Edgar Atheling, Malcolm of Scotland, Danish troops, Waltheof, and Gospatric. Although Gospatric briefly recovered Bamberg, the attempt to restore Edgar to the throne ultimately collapsed. In the southwest, Brian of Brittany defeated the last major invasion led by Harold Godwinson's sons, Godwin and Edmund, at the Battle of Northam. William's most brutal response came during the harrying of the north between 1069 and 1070. Norman forces devastated Yorkshire and the surrounding regions, burning crops, destroying homes, slaughtering livestock, and killing large numbers of people. Thousands more died from starvation, disease, and exposure. The campaign broke northern resistance, but left entire districts ruined for years. Resistance continued in East Anglia under Hereward the Wake, who established a rebel base on the Isle of Ely. He was joined by Morcar and by survivors associated with Peterborough Abbey. Although their position was naturally protected by marshland, William eventually surrounded and defeated them. At the same time, major changes transformed the English Church. Archbishop Stigand of Canterbury was removed and replaced by Lanfranc, a trusted Norman churchman. This marked the beginning of a wider replacement of English bishops and abbots with Norman or continental clergy. Denmark also withdrew from the conflict after reaching an agreement with William. Scotland expanded southward during this period, absorbing much of the former Kingdom of Cumbria. Gospatric challenged this expansion by invading Cumberland, claiming that Malcolm had taken it by force rather than legitimate right. In Wales, dynastic warfare continued. The sons of Gruffydd ap Llywelyn challenged Bledyn ap Cynfyn, but most of the leading claimants died at the Battle of Machain, leaving Bledyn as the dominant ruler of Gwynedd and Powys. In 1071, William finally defeated Hereward's rebellion. Edwin of Mercia also attempted to rise against Norman authority, but was betrayed and killed by his own followers. During the same period, Alan Rufus of Brittany received the vast honour of Richmond in Yorkshire and began building Richmond Castle. His descendants and relatives would remain closely linked to the lordship for centuries. Far beyond Britain, another important chapter of Roman history came to an end. The last Byzantine territories in southern Italy fell to the Normans, ending direct Eastern Roman rule in the Western Mediterranean. In 1072, William invaded Scotland and forced Malcolm III to accept the Treaty of Abernethy. Malcolm recognized William's supremacy and agreed to expel or control English exiles at his court. Gospatric, once again displaced, eventually received lands around Dunbar and the Merse, creating the foundation of the later earldom of Lothian and Dunbar. Norman pressure also increased in Wales. Armies entered Gwynedd, seized Arfon, and established new castles and lordships along the border. Powerful marcher lords were given extraordinary freedom to conquer and govern Welsh territory. Their authority was almost royal, allowing them to build fortresses, raise armies, and create new feudal estates. The revolt of the Earls in 1075 became the last major aristocratic attempt to overthrow William. It involved Waltheof of Northumberland, Roger of Hereford, Ralph de Gale, and other nobles with strong Breton connections. The conspiracy was defeated by forces led by powerful bishops and royal officials. Waltheof was later executed, becoming the only English earl put to death by William. Wales remained divided by internal rivalry. Gruffydd ap Cynan tried to recover Gwynedd but was forced back into Irish exile. Bledyn ap Cynfyn was murdered after betrayal by regional nobles, and the kingdoms of northern and southern Wales again passed between competing dynasties. Norman influence extended into law and architecture as well. Trial by combat appeared in England, while work began on the White Tower in London, the central fortress that later became the Tower of London. William also created the New Forest by clearing settlements and reserving a vast region for royal hunting. The decisive Welsh conflict of this period came in 1081 at the Battle of Mynyd Carn. Gruffydd ap Cynan and Rhys ap Tewdwr returned with a mixed force of Welsh, Irish, and Danish warriors. They defeated and killed their principal rivals, allowing Gruffydd to recover Gwynedd and Rhys to regain Deheubarth. Their victory temporarily restored native authority in important parts of Wales. The Normans nevertheless continued their advance. They divided conquered areas of Gwent into powerful marcher lordships such as Abergavenny, Monmouth, Caerleon, Chepstow, and Usk. Further invasions struck Gwynedd, Powys, and Brycheiniog. Bernard de Neufmarché conquered much of Brycheiniog and transformed it into the Norman lordship of Brecon. By the end of the 1080s, the political landscape of Britain had been permanently altered. Norman rule was secure across England, powerful castles dominated the countryside, and the old Anglo-Saxon nobility had nearly disappeared. Wales remained unconquered as a whole, but its borderlands were steadily divided among Norman lords. Scotland preserved its independence, but had been forced to recognize Norman power. The conquest of 1066 had therefore become far more than a change of dynasty. It had created a new aristocracy, transformed the church, reshaped the land, and begun centuries of conflict between the Norman rulers of England and the surviving Celtic kingdoms of Britain. From 1090 onward, Britain, Ireland, and parts of Western Europe experienced constant political and military change. The bishopric of Wells moved to Bath, while Norman nobles expanded their influence across Wales. Robert Fitzhamon conquered Morgan on Wg and created the Lordship of Glamorgan, while Bernard de Neufmarché founded the Lordship of Brecknock after the fall of Brycheiniog. Welsh rulers fought fiercely to defend their lands. Rhys ap Tewdwr battled the Norman invaders but was killed at Brecon in 1093, a defeat that opened much of Deheubarth to Norman conquest. Even so, repeated Welsh uprisings, led by figures such as Cadogan ap Bledin and Gruffydd ap Rhys, forced the Normans into years of difficult warfare, with victories and setbacks on both sides. At the same time, King William II of England strengthened Norman authority by seizing Cumberland and Westmoreland and reinforcing Carlisle. In Ireland, Muirchertach Ua Briain captured Dublin, ending Danish control of the city. Across Europe, church organization also evolved as several dioceses were reorganized, including the creation of Norwich, Ely, and Carlisle, while major synods in Ireland sought to establish a more structured diocesan system. During this era, influential religious institutions also appeared, including the Hospitallers and the Knights Templar, both of which would become major military and charitable orders. The greatest turning point came in 1095, when Emperor Alexios I Komnenos requested military assistance from Pope Urban II against the Seljuk Turks. The appeal inspired the First Crusade, which united knights and rulers from across Europe. Between 1096 and 1099, crusading armies captured Nicaea, Antioch, Jerusalem, and other important cities, leading to the creation of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, and the County of Tripoli. Many warriors from Britain also took part, while others, including Edgar Atheling, later served in the famous Varangian Guard of the Byzantine Empire. Scotland also underwent dramatic change. Edgar overthrew King Domnall Ban in 1097 with support from his brothers Alexander and David. After Edgar's death, David I gradually united Scotland with Cumbria and the Merse, encouraging large numbers of Norman, Breton, and Flemish nobles to settle in his kingdom. His reign introduced important legal reforms, expanded royal authority, and permanently reshaped medieval Scotland. Meanwhile, conflicts between rival noble families continued for generations, especially during the MacWilliams and Macketh struggles. Throughout the early 12th century, Wales remained a battlefield between native princes and Norman lords. Gruffydd ap Cynan, Gruffydd ap Rhys, Owain ap Gruffydd, and other Welsh leaders repeatedly challenged Norman occupation, winning major victories such as Crugmore, while recovering large parts of the country. However, the Norman marches steadily expanded, eventually controlling much of eastern and southern Wales through powerful frontier lordships. Elsewhere, political power shifted rapidly. El Cid established his multicultural principality in Valencia, the Almohads rose to dominate Muslim Iberia, and the Norman rulers of southern Italy transformed their lands into the Kingdom of Sicily. In England, Henry I hoped his daughter Matilda would inherit the throne, but Stephen of Blois seized the crown after Henry's death in 1135. The result was a devastating civil war known as the Anarchy, which lasted until Stephen finally recognized Matilda's son, the future Henry II, as his heir. By the middle of the 12th century, Britain and Western Europe had been transformed by conquest, crusade, religious reform, and the emergence of new kingdoms whose influence would shape medieval history for centuries. During the 1140s, Britain, Ireland, and the Eastern Mediterranean continued to experience political conflict and religious change. Baldwin de Redvers became the first Earl of Devon, while Welsh princes struggled for dominance. Owain Gwynedd removed his brother Cadwallader from power after his involvement in the murder of a rival prince, and steadily strengthened Gwynedd by capturing important Norman fortresses, including Mold and later Rhuddlan Castle. His victories expanded Welsh influence deep into contested borderlands, despite repeated resistance from the rulers of Powys and the powerful Norman earls along the frontier. Meanwhile, the Christian world launched the Second Crusade after the fall of the County of Edessa. Between 1147 and 1149, England, Normandy, Brittany, Scotland, and many other European states joined the campaign. Although the Crusaders hoped to recover their lost territories, the expedition ended in failure. Around the same time, the Almohads replaced the Almoravids as the dominant Muslim power in Iberia, reshaping the political landscape of the peninsula. Religious institutions also continued to grow, with the founding of the Order of St. Lazarus in Jerusalem and the reorganization of the Irish Church through the Synod of Kells, which established 32 dioceses under 4 archbishoprics. A new era began in 1154 when Stephen died and Henry II became the first Angevin king of England. His vast dominions stretched across England and large parts of France, creating what later became known as the Angevin Empire. Soon afterward, Pope Adrian IV granted Henry authority over Ireland, encouraging greater English involvement across the Irish Sea. At the same time, Irish politics remained fiercely contested as High King Turlough O'Conor launched a massive naval campaign against Ailech. Although his fleet defeated its opponents after a hard-fought 2-day battle, heavy losses forced the expedition to withdraw before achieving complete success. In Scotland and the Isles, Somerled emerged as one of the most remarkable rulers of the century. After years of conflict with Godred Olafsson, he secured control of the southern Hebrides before eventually seizing the Isle of Man and becoming ruler of nearly the entire Kingdom of the Isles. His growing power ended dramatically in 1164 when he was killed during an invasion of mainland Scotland, allowing Godred to recover much of his former kingdom. Henry II spent much of his reign trying to impose English authority over Wales. In 1157, he launched one of the largest invasions ever seen in the region, supported by a powerful fleet and thousands of soldiers. Although his naval expedition collapsed and his army suffered defeat near Eulo, negotiations forced Owain Gwynedd to surrender several eastern territories. Welsh resistance remained unbroken. Rhys ap Gruffydd repeatedly captured Norman castles, recovered lost lands across to Hubarth, and after periods of conflict and imprisonment, even secured recognition from Henry before resuming his campaigns against Norman strongholds. In 1165, nearly every major Welsh kingdom united against England, forcing Henry to abandon another invasion after difficult conditions and determined resistance. Events in Ireland soon transformed the history of the British Isles. Following the exile of Diarmait MacMurrough, Cambro-Norman forces led by Richard de Clare, known as Strongbow, invaded Ireland in 1169. They rapidly captured Waterford, Wexford, and Dublin before restoring Diarmait to his throne. After his death, Strongbow inherited Leinster through marriage, alarming Henry II, who crossed into Ireland in 1172. The English king secured the submission of many Norman and Gaelic rulers and proclaimed himself Lord of Ireland, laying the foundations for centuries of English influence there. The following years were marked by rebellion and violence. Henry II faced a massive revolt led by his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine, several of his sons, numerous French nobles, and the Kingdom of Scotland. The rebellion ended after the Scottish defeat at Alnwick. In Wales, tensions remained high, culminating in the infamous Abergavenny massacre of 1175, when William de Braos invited leading Welsh nobles to a feast before having them murdered. Throughout Europe, the medieval Inquisition also began to emerge as an important institution within the Church. The wider Mediterranean was transformed again in 1187 when Saladin captured Jerusalem, bringing the Kingdom of Jerusalem to an end. The loss shocked Christian Europe and inspired the Third Crusade. England, Scotland, Normandy, Brittany, and many other states joined the campaign under famous leaders, including Richard the Lionheart. Although the Crusaders failed to recover Jerusalem itself, they succeeded in recapturing Acre and preserving a Christian foothold in the Holy Land. During this period, the Teutonic Order was also founded, eventually becoming one of medieval Europe's most influential military orders. Richard I inherited the English throne in 1189 after the death of Henry II. In Wales, Rhys ap Gruffydd considered himself released from previous obligations and quickly resumed attacks against Norman castles. Internal struggles also continued within Gwynedd, where rival branches of the royal family fought for supremacy, most notably at the Battle of Aberconwy in 1194. By the close of the 12th century, the political map of Britain, Ireland, and Western Europe had been reshaped by conquest, crusades, dynastic conflict, and the growing ambitions of powerful kingdoms whose influence would define the medieval age. Between the late 12th and mid-13th centuries, Britain and Western Europe witnessed constant political struggles, dynastic rivalries, crusades, and major territorial changes. In England, William Longbeard briefly led London's poor in a rebellion against corrupt officials before being captured and executed in 1196, though many later regarded him as a martyr. In Wales, the death of Rhys ap Gruffydd the following year ended a period of stability as his sons fought among themselves for control of Deheubarth. Meanwhile, church administration continued to evolve, with the Diocese of Bath relocating to Glastonbury before later returning to Bath and Wells. The closing years of Richard the Lionheart's reign also marked an important turning point. After the death of the last traditional High King of Ireland and renewed warfare in Wales, Richard himself died in 1199 from an infected crossbow wound. His brother John inherited the English throne, beginning a reign that would be remembered for military defeats and political unrest. Across Wales, Llywelyn ap Iorwerth, later known as Llywelyn the Great, steadily emerged as the strongest native ruler, bringing Gwynedd under his firm control and beginning one of the most successful Welsh reigns of the Middle Ages. England and France soon entered another long conflict that dramatically altered European politics. The Anglo-French War ended with England permanently losing Normandy, while France greatly strengthened its position on the continent. At the same time, the Fourth Crusade abandoned its original goal of reaching the Holy Land and instead captured Constantinople in 1204. The Byzantine Empire fractured into several successor states, while the Latin Empire and other Crusader kingdoms divided its former territories, permanently changing the balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean. Throughout these years, Llywelyn the Great expanded his influence across Wales through both diplomacy and warfare. He married Joan, the illegitimate daughter of King John, but relations between the two rulers soon deteriorated. John repeatedly invaded Gwynedd, forcing Llywelyn to surrender territory before the Welsh prince organized a massive uprising in 1212. Supported by several Welsh rulers and encouraged by Pope Innocent III's opposition to King John, Llywelyn quickly recovered nearly all of his lost lands and re-established Welsh independence across much of the country. King John's authority collapsed even further after his conflict with the English barons. In 1215, the rebels forced him to accept the Magna Carta, a landmark agreement intended to limit royal power. John almost immediately rejected its terms, triggering the First Barons' War. French Prince Louis invaded England with support from rebellious nobles, while Llywelyn seized the opportunity to capture several Norman castles in Wales. Following John's death, the conflict gradually ended, allowing England to recover under the new government. Llywelyn's prestige continued to rise during the following decade. By 1216, most Welsh rulers acknowledged him as the leading Prince of Wales, even though he officially styled himself Prince of North Wales. Meanwhile, crusading activity continued across Europe with the Fifth and Sixth Crusades, while Brittany changed ruling dynasties and southern France experienced the violence of the Albigensian Crusade. Political authority throughout Britain and France remained closely tied to these wider European conflicts. Scotland and the Celtic world also experienced significant change. Rebellions by the Maceths and MacWilliams were finally crushed, Galloway lost its independence, and the Hebrides eventually separated from the Kingdom of Man to form their own realm. Farther south, the Emirate of Granada emerged as the last major Muslim kingdom in Iberia after the Christian reconquest swept across much of the peninsula. In the east, Mongol expansion reshaped the Black Sea region, isolating territories once connected to the Empire of Trebizond. After Llywelyn the Great died in 1240, his son Dafydd inherited the leadership of Wales, but immediately faced renewed English pressure. Forced to surrender territory after invasion, he later recovered much of it through war before dying without securing lasting stability. His nephew, Llywelyn ap Gruffydd, later remembered as Llywelyn the Last, gradually became the dominant Welsh ruler after defeating rival family members in a civil war. By the middle of the 13th century, he had restored much of Welsh strength by reclaiming important regions including the Perfedwlad, Brycheiniog, Builth, and several neighboring territories, standing as the final great native prince before England completed its conquest of Wales. From the late 13th century onward, Britain, Wales, Scotland, and the Eastern Mediterranean entered one of the most turbulent periods of the Middle Ages. In Wales, Llywelyn ap Gruffydd strengthened his position after defeating an English invasion at the Battle of Camlann in 1257. Soon afterward, he officially adopted the title Prince of Wales, receiving recognition from many Welsh rulers and powerful allies. At the same time, England was shaken by constitutional conflict as Simon de Montfort and a group of rebellious barons forced King Henry III to accept reforms that greatly limited royal authority and strengthened Parliament. Meanwhile, the Byzantine Empire achieved an extraordinary recovery in 1261 by reclaiming Constantinople from the Latin Empire, restoring Byzantine rule after nearly 60 years. England, however, remained divided by civil war. During the Second Barons' War, Simon de Montfort briefly ruled the kingdom after capturing both King Henry III and Prince Edward. His success proved temporary, as Edward escaped, rallied loyal supporters, and defeated de Montfort at the Battle of Evesham in 1265, restoring royal power. Welsh fortunes reached their highest point in 1267 when the Treaty of Montgomery officially recognized Llywelyn as Prince of Wales, although he still acknowledged the English king as his feudal overlord. Across Europe, the crusading movement continued with the 8th and 9th Crusades, while Prince Edward gained valuable military experience before eventually becoming Edward I of England. Relations between Edward I and Llywelyn gradually collapsed. In 1277, Edward declared the Welsh prince a rebel and invaded Wales, forcing him to surrender much of his territory under the Treaty of Aberconwy. The remaining Welsh lands stayed independent only briefly. In 1282, another national uprising broke out, but Llywelyn was killed in battle. His brother Dafydd continued the resistance until 1283, when England completed its conquest of Wales. Dafydd was captured and executed, and Edward permanently incorporated Wales into his kingdom through the Statute of Rhuddlan, replacing the old Welsh political system with English administration. While Wales lost its independence, Scotland entered a succession crisis after the death of Alexander III. The young Margaret, Maid of Norway, died before reaching Scotland, leaving the throne disputed. John Balliol was eventually crowned king, but growing English interference created deep resentment. Among those affected was William Wallace, whose father's death inspired him to begin a guerrilla campaign against English occupation. At the same time, the last Crusader stronghold at Acre fell to the Mamluks in 1291, bringing the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the Holy Land to an end. The struggle for Scottish independence soon intensified. Edward I invaded Scotland, seized the Stone of Destiny, and attempted to bring the kingdom under English rule. Andrew Murray and William Wallace organized resistance, achieving a stunning victory at Stirling Bridge before suffering defeat at Falkirk. Wallace returned to guerrilla warfare while other Scottish nobles continued the fight. Even after his capture and execution in 1305, the Scottish cause survived. The following year, Robert the Bruce crowned himself King of Scots. Although initially defeated, he adopted Wallace's strategy of mobile warfare and gradually rebuilt Scottish resistance. During the same period, Europe witnessed the dramatic downfall of the Knights Templar. King Philip IV of France ordered their arrest, extracted confessions through torture, and pressured the papacy to dissolve the order. Many surviving Templars disappeared into other military orders, while legends claimed that some found refuge in Scotland and secretly supported Bruce's campaign. The conflict reached its decisive moment in 1314 at the Battle of Bannockburn. Robert the Bruce's remarkable victory effectively secured Scottish independence and ended England's domination of the kingdom. In the years that followed, Scotland expanded its influence into Ireland under Edward Bruce, while unrest continued in Wales with new uprisings against English rule. Finally, in 1320, the Scottish nobles issued the famous Declaration of Arbroath, affirming Robert the Bruce as their rightful king and proclaiming Scotland's determination to remain an independent nation, a statement that became one of medieval Europe's greatest declarations of national identity. The early 14th century was marked by political upheaval across Britain and Western Europe. England descended into the Despencer War as powerful nobles rebelled against King Edward II and his unpopular favorite, Hugh Despencer the Younger. Although the revolt failed, resentment toward the king continued to grow. In 1326, Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer invaded England, overthrew Edward II, and placed his young son Edward III on the throne. Edward II was captured while fleeing through Wales, and many of his closest supporters were brutally executed, bringing an end to one of England's most troubled reigns. Peace briefly returned between England and Scotland with the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in 1328, recognizing Scottish independence. Soon afterward, however, Robert the Bruce died, leaving the throne to his young son David II. Scotland once again became a battleground as Edward Balliol, supported by English forces, attempted to seize the crown. This struggle developed into the Third War of Scottish Independence, a conflict that lasted for decades before David II was finally restored. Meanwhile, Europe entered the long and destructive Hundred Years' War between England's Plantagenet dynasty and France's House of Valois. The conflict spread far beyond the two kingdoms, drawing in Brittany, Scotland, Normandy, Aquitaine, and many other regions. At the same time, Brittany became consumed by its own bitter war of succession, with rival families backed by England and France competing for control of the duchy. Famous figures such as Jeanne de Belleville, remembered as the Lioness of Brittany, gained legendary status through daring naval raids and relentless resistance. The middle of the century witnessed constant warfare across France and Brittany. Battles, sieges, shifting alliances, and political betrayals repeatedly changed the balance of power before the First Treaty of Guérande finally ended the Breton conflict in 1365, securing the rule of the House of Montfort. During the same period, Scotland experienced another major dynastic change when the Stuart family inherited the throne in 1371, beginning a royal dynasty that would rule for centuries. Religious division also reshaped medieval Europe. The papacy moved to Avignon during the so-called Babylonian captivity of the Church, and only a few decades later, the Western Schism divided Catholic Europe between rival popes in Rome and Avignon. England supported one claimant, while Scotland and France recognized the other, adding another layer of political rivalry to an already unstable continent. By the end of the 14th century, resistance against English rule returned to Wales. In 1400, Owain Glyndwr declared himself Prince of Wales and launched the largest Welsh rebellion since the conquest of the country. Within a few years, he controlled most of Wales, formed alliances with France, Scotland, and Brittany, restored traditional Welsh law, and proposed an independent Welsh state. Although English forces gradually regained lost territory, Glyndwr continued fighting through guerrilla warfare long after losing his castles. His disappearance after 1412 turned him into one of Britain's greatest historical legends, and many believed he remained alive in secret long after the rebellion had faded. The Welsh uprising officially ended in 1421, but its legacy endured. Only a few years later, another Welsh family quietly entered English politics. Owain Tudor married Catherine of Valois, the widow of King Henry V, establishing the Tudor family within the English royal circle. Their descendants would eventually found one of England's most famous dynasties and permanently reshape the history of Britain. Throughout the 15th century, Europe continued to struggle with political rivalries and religious debates. The Council of Florence attempted to reunite the Roman and Eastern churches, but ultimately failed, leaving their centuries-old division unresolved. Meanwhile, noble feuds, succession disputes, and struggles for royal influence continued across England and Brittany, proving that the medieval world remained defined by shifting alliances, ambitious rulers, and almost continuous warfare. The middle of the 15th century marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. Edmund Tudor, son of Owen Tudor and Catherine of Valois, married Margaret Beaufort, creating the bloodline that would eventually establish the powerful Tudor dynasty. At the same time, Europe witnessed two world-changing events in 1453. England suffered its final defeat in the Hundred Years' War, losing almost all of its French possessions, while Constantinople fell to Sultan Mehmed II, bringing the Byzantine Empire to an end after more than 1,000 years. The Ottoman victory transformed the Eastern Mediterranean and elevated the Sultan as the heir to the Roman imperial tradition. England soon descended into the brutal Wars of the Roses, a decades-long struggle between the rival houses of Lancaster and York. Noble families across England and Wales chose opposing sides, turning the conflict into a nationwide civil war. Battles, executions, and shifting loyalties became common as powerful lords fought for the English crown. Owen Tudor was executed after the Battle of Mortimer's Cross, while many leading nobles from both factions met similar fates. Despite these losses, the Tudor family survived and continued to build support. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire continued its rapid expansion, capturing the Duchy of Athens and later the Empire of Trebizond, the last surviving Byzantine successor state. In France, King Louis XI spent much of his reign suppressing rebellious nobles and strengthening royal authority. Brittany became another major battlefield as rival factions struggled over the duchy's future, with England and France repeatedly intervening in its affairs. The conflicts eventually evolved into the Franco-Breton War, gradually weakening Breton independence. A decisive turning point arrived in 1485 when Henry Tudor defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field. His victory ended the Wars of the Roses and placed the Tudor dynasty on the English throne. Henry VII immediately worked to restore stability after decades of civil conflict, while Brittany continued resisting French expansion before finally accepting union with France through political marriage. During these same years, Cornwall experienced two major rebellions as heavy taxation and Yorkist support fueled widespread unrest against Tudor rule. The beginning of the 16th century brought a short-lived peace between England and Scotland through the Treaty of Perpetual Peace, sealed by the marriage of James IV of Scotland and Margaret Tudor. Although the agreement failed to prevent future wars, it eventually united the royal bloodlines of both kingdoms. Across Europe, another event transformed history forever, when Martin Luther challenged the authority of the Catholic Church in 1517, launching the Protestant Reformation and reshaping Christianity. King Henry VIII soon carried these religious changes even further. After breaking with Rome, he declared himself supreme head of the Church of England and rejected papal authority. Wales was fully incorporated into the English legal system. English law replaced many traditional Welsh institutions, and the use of Welsh in government was greatly restricted. Henry also dissolved hundreds of monasteries, confiscated their lands and wealth, closed religious houses, destroyed shrines, and dramatically altered the religious and social life of England, Wales, and Ireland. In Ireland, Henry strengthened English authority by proclaiming himself King of Ireland and beginning the Tudor reconquest, while also establishing the Church of Ireland. Scotland entered another period of uncertainty after the death of James V, leaving the infant Mary, Queen of Scots, to inherit the throne. Henry attempted to force a marriage between his son Edward and the young Scottish queen, triggering the conflict known as the Rough Wooing. Although the English achieved major military victories, Scotland refused to surrender its independence. When Henry VIII died in 1547, his son Edward VI inherited the throne. Under the guidance of powerful advisors, Protestant reforms accelerated as hospitals, guilds, colleges, and religious institutions were closed or dissolved. These sweeping changes permanently transformed the political, religious, and cultural landscape of Britain, ending the medieval order and laying the foundations of the modern British state. The second half of the 16th century brought profound religious and political transformation to Britain and Ireland. In 1549, Western England erupted in the Prayer Book Rebellion as people in Cornwall and Devon resisted the introduction of the English-language Book of Common Prayer. The uprising was fueled not only by religious change, but also by the earlier destruction of monasteries, which had long supported local culture and learning. Although the rebels briefly gained momentum, government forces eventually crushed the movement after weeks of fierce fighting. England's religious direction changed repeatedly over the following years. After Edward VI died in 1553, Lady Jane Grey briefly claimed the throne before being removed by Mary I. A committed Catholic, Mary attempted to restore Roman Catholicism through harsh persecution of Protestants, earning a lasting reputation for religious intolerance. Yet despite her efforts, English control over Ireland continued to expand. When Elizabeth I succeeded her in 1558, England permanently lost Calais, its final territory on the European mainland, but entered a new period of political stability under Protestant rule. Across the British Isles, new struggles emerged. Mary, Queen of Scots, returned to Scotland in 1561, but was eventually forced to abdicate in favour of her infant son, James VI. Fleeing to England, she became Elizabeth's prisoner before being executed in 1587 after being linked to plots against the English crown. During the same period, Welsh culture experienced an important revival as scholars completed the first modern Welsh translations of the New Testament and later the entire Bible, greatly strengthening the language and Protestant worship in Wales. Europe remained dominated by conflict between Christian and Ottoman powers. The Knights Hospitaller successfully defended Malta against a massive Ottoman siege in 1565, while the Ottoman Empire later captured Cyprus and completed its conquest of the last remaining Latin territories in the eastern Mediterranean. In 1588, Spain attempted to overthrow Elizabeth I through the famous Spanish Armada. Despite its enormous size, the invasion failed, preserving England's independence and confirming its growing naval strength. Ireland experienced nearly constant unrest as English plantation policies expanded. Efforts to settle English colonists in Offaly, Loire, Munster, Ulster, and other regions met determined resistance from Gaelic Irish lords. Large rebellions, including the Desmond Uprisings and the 9 Years' War led by Hugh O'Neill and Hugh Roe O'Donnell, sought to halt English expansion. Although Irish resistance was fierce, the defeat of these movements allowed the English crown to strengthen its control over the island through permanent plantations and increased immigration from Britain. France also endured decades of civil conflict during the Wars of Religion. Brittany became deeply divided between Catholic and Protestant factions, while Spain repeatedly intervened in support of Catholic forces. The violence finally subsided with the Edict of Nantes in 1598, which granted limited religious tolerance and ended one of the bloodiest chapters in French history. A major dynastic shift occurred in 1603 when James VI of Scotland inherited the English throne after Elizabeth's death, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland under a single monarch. Although both kingdoms remained legally separate, the Stuart dynasty now ruled across Britain and Ireland. The new government accelerated the plantation of Ulster, settling thousands of English and Scottish families in Northern Ireland and permanently changing the region's religious and cultural landscape. Tensions between kings and their subjects continued to grow throughout the early 17th century. Conflicts over religion, royal authority, and political power eventually exploded into the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. Civil wars spread across England, Scotland, and Ireland, dividing royalists and parliamentarians, while Ireland descended into a devastating struggle involving native Irish Confederates, English forces, and Scottish armies. The arrival of Oliver Cromwell in 1649 marked one of the darkest chapters of the conflict, as brutal military campaigns and massacres left lasting scars that shaped relations across the British Isles for generations. The middle of the 17th century was dominated by civil war, religious conflict, and political revolution across Britain and Ireland. During the First English Civil War, the Royalists achieved a series of impressive victories throughout Cornwall and the West Country, capturing important cities such as Bristol, Exeter, and Dartmouth. However, despite these early successes, heavy casualties gradually weakened their position. The arrival of Parliament's disciplined New Model Army changed the course of the war, and decisive victories at battles such as Naseby, Langport, and Torrington destroyed Royalist resistance. By 1646, the last major strongholds had fallen, ending the king's control of Western England. The conflict soon spread across the entire British Isles. Scotland entered its own civil war as the brilliant commander James Graham, Marquis of Montrose, fought in support of King Charles I with assistance from Irish Confederate troops. Although Montrose won a remarkable series of victories, his campaign ultimately collapsed, forcing him into exile before his eventual capture and execution. At the same time, renewed fighting erupted in England and Wales, while Cromwell's growing influence transformed Parliament into the dominant political force. The execution of Charles I in 1649 shocked Europe and marked the temporary end of the English monarchy. His son was immediately recognized as King Charles II by Scotland and several overseas colonies, but Oliver Cromwell and the New Model Army quickly took control of England. Cromwell purged Parliament, defeated Royalist forces, invaded Scotland, and established himself as Lord Protector. His government introduced military rule while suppressing opposition throughout the three kingdoms. Nowhere were Cromwell's policies more devastating than in Ireland. Following years of rebellion, English conquest reached unprecedented levels. Large numbers of Catholic landowners lost their estates, many families were forced westward into Connaught, and thousands of Irish people were transported overseas as indentured servants. New plantation policies dramatically altered land ownership, while Catholics were excluded from political life for generations. These measures permanently transformed Irish society and deepened divisions that would endure for centuries. Following Cromwell's death, political instability returned. His son Richard proved unable to maintain control, leading to the collapse of the Protectorate. In 1660, the monarchy was restored as Charles II returned to the throne, bringing an end to England's republican experiment. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire continued expanding by capturing Crete, while France experienced major tax revolts and regional unrest, particularly in Brittany. Religious conflict remained one of the defining features of the late 17th century. In Scotland, harsh persecution of Presbyterian dissenters became known as the Killing Time. England faced renewed political crisis when James II openly promoted Catholic interests, leading many influential nobles to invite William of Orange to intervene. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 forced James into exile and placed William and Mary on the throne, permanently strengthening parliamentary authority over the monarchy. The years that followed saw continued conflict in Ireland and Scotland as supporters of the exiled Stuart dynasty, known as Jacobites, fought to restore their former king. Although these campaigns ultimately failed, they shaped politics throughout the British Isles. New penal laws targeted Catholics and other religious minorities, while political power became increasingly concentrated in Protestant hands. In 1707, another historic transformation occurred with the Act of Union, which united the kingdoms of England and Scotland into the Kingdom of Great Britain under Queen Anne. Even after the Union, Jacobite supporters continued organizing rebellions in hopes of restoring the Stuart dynasty, but every uprising ended in failure. Following Anne's death in 1714, the Hanoverian dynasty assumed the British throne, beginning a new chapter in British history. The 18th century brought repeated Jacobite rebellions, culminating in the famous Rising of 1745 led by Charles Edward Stuart, better known as Bonnie Prince Charlie. After its defeat, the British government imposed severe restrictions on Highland culture, weakening the traditional clan system. At the same time, revolutionary ideas swept across France. The French Revolution abolished Brittany's ancient privileges, dissolved its historic institutions, and reorganized the region into modern administrative departments. Royalist resistance continued through the Chouannerie, while the Reign of Terror claimed thousands of lives. By the close of the century, revolutionary France even attempted an invasion of Wales in 1797, but the expedition ended without success, bringing an eventful era of wars, revolutions, and political transformation to a close. The closing years of the 18th century marked the end of several historic eras across Europe. In 1797, the ancient Republic of Venice, which had existed for more than 1,000 years, surrendered to Napoleon Bonaparte, bringing one of Europe's longest-lived republics to an end. Meanwhile, Brittany experienced another wave of royalist resistance as the Third Chouannerie spread across the region. Although Republican forces eventually restored control, Napoleon's rise to power soon replaced years of instability with a more centralized government. Napoleon's victories also reshaped the political map of Europe. In 1804, Francis II transformed his rule into the Austrian Empire, and only 2 years later, the Holy Roman Empire formally dissolved under French pressure after nearly a millennium of existence. Across Britain, another historic chapter closed in 1807 with the death of Henry Benedict Stuart, the last Jacobite claimant, ending the direct Stuart claim to the British throne. The 19th century saw growing demands for political reform and national identity. Industrial unrest erupted during the Merthyr Rising of 1831, remembered as the first major use of the red flag as a symbol of working-class resistance in Britain. 8 years later, the Newport Rising became one of the largest Chartist demonstrations, demanding wider voting rights and democratic reform. Although both uprisings were suppressed, they inspired future movements for political change. National awareness also expanded in Wales and Brittany. Welsh activists founded Cymru Fyd in the late 19th century to campaign for greater self-government, while Breton organizations promoted regional identity, cultural revival, and eventually political autonomy. During the early 20th century, several nationalist parties emerged in both regions, although internal disagreements and changing political circumstances often limited their success. The Second World War dramatically altered Brittany's history. After France fell in 1940, the region's strategic ports became major German submarine bases. Some Breton nationalist groups collaborated with the Nazi occupation, while far larger numbers joined the French resistance. The Breton Maquis carried out sabotage, intelligence gathering, and guerrilla warfare, making life increasingly difficult for German forces. Following the Allied landings in Normandy, resistance fighters played a crucial role by destroying railways and disrupting German reinforcements. Fierce battles across Brittany helped secure the region's liberation before the end of the war. In the decades that followed, attention shifted from armed conflict to cultural preservation and political activism. Organizations dedicated to protecting the Breton language, traditions, and identity were established, while Cornwall developed its own nationalist movements seeking greater local autonomy. Some Breton groups favored complete independence, whereas others pursued regional self-government within France through democratic means. Constitutional reforms also reshaped Wales. The Government of Wales Act in 1998 created a devolved National Assembly, granting Wales significant powers over its own domestic affairs and marking the greatest expansion of Welsh self-government in centuries. Around the same time, campaigns began calling for the reunification of historic Brittany by restoring Loire-Atlantique to the Breton region after its separation during the Second World War. The opening decades of the 21st century have seen regional identity remain an important political and cultural issue. New Breton political parties continue advocating greater autonomy or independence within a democratic European framework, while protest movements have opposed government policies affecting the region. Similar discussions have also appeared elsewhere in Britain, including the creation of the Devon independence movement in 2021. Although the methods have changed dramatically since earlier centuries, debates over local identity, self-government, and cultural heritage remain an enduring part of the history of Brittany, Wales, Cornwall, and the wider British Isles.